This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real events or persons is purely coincidental. This story is purely fictional and does not promote or encourage any form of violence. I guess if she was planning to arrest us, she'd have done it by now, Royce said. Arrest us? This is Thrace we're talking about, for sake. They've had her for more than a year. She's Empress Modena now. Yeah, but... What? I don't know, Hadrian said, remembering the look on Thrace's face. She doesn't look well. I'm not sure what's going on in the palace, but it's not good. And I promised her father I'd look out for her. Royce shook his head in frustration. Can we focus on one rescue at a time? For a man in retirement, you're really busy. Besides, Theron's idea of success was to get his eldest daughter a cooper's shop. I think he might settle for his daughter being crowned empress. Now let's get rid of these horses and make our way down to the wharf. We need to find the Emerald Storm. Chapter 4. The Race. While not as large or as wealthy as Colnora, the imperial capital of Equista was the most powerful city in Avren. The palace dated back to before the age of Glenmorgan and had originally been a governor's residence in the ancient days of the Navronian Empire. Scholars pointed to the grey rock of the castle's foundation with pride and boasted about how imperial engineers from Persepliquis had laid it. Here at High Court Fields, great tournaments were held each wintertide. The best knights from all over Peladon arrived to compete in jousting, fencing, and other contests of skill. These week-long events included an ongoing feast for the nobles and provided healthy revenue for the merchants who showed their wares along the streets. The city became a carnival of sights and sounds that attracted visitors for hundreds of miles. Much of Equista's economic success came from possessing the largest and busiest saltwater port in Avren. The docks were awash with all manner of sailing watercraft, brigs, trawlers, grain ships, merchant vessels, and warships, all anchored in its harbor. To the south lay the massive shipyard, along with rope, net, and sail manufacturers. The northern end of the bay held the wharf and its fish houses, livestock pens, lumber yards, and tar boilers. All the industries of the sea and seafaring were represented. Which one is the Emerald Storm? Hadrian asked, looking at the forest of masts and rigging that lined the docks. Let's try asking at the information office. Royce hooked his thumb at a tavern perched on the edge of the dock. The wooden walls were bleached white with salt, and the clapboards were warped like ocean waves. The door hung askew off leather hinges, and above it, a weathered sign in the shape of a fish announced, "The Salty Mackerel." The tavern had few windows, leaving the interior dim and smoky. Each tiny table had a melted candle, and a weak fire smoldered in a round brick hearth in the center of the room. Men dressed in loose trousers, long checkered shirts, and wide-brimmed hats with glossy tops packed the place. Many sat with pipes in their mouths and their feet on tables. Some stood leaning against posts. All heads turned when Hadrian and Royce entered, and Hadrian realized just how much they stood out in their tunics and cloaks. "Hello," Hadrian smiled as he struggled to close the door. The wind whistled through and snuffed out the 3 candles nearest them. "Sorry, could use some better hinges." "Iron's hinges just rust overnight here," the bartender said. The thin, crooked man wiped the counter with one hand while gathering empty mugs on the other. "What do you two want?" "Looking for the Emerald Storm," Royce spoke up. Neither took more than a step inside. None of the haggard faces looked friendly, and Hadrian liked the comfort of a nearby exit. "What do you want with it?" another man asked. "We heard it was a good ship, and we were wondering if there were any openings for sailors." This brought a riotous round of laughter. "And where be these sailors who be looking for a job?" Another voice bellowed from within the murky haze. "Certainly not 2 sand crabs like you." More laughter. "So what you're saying is you don't know anything about the Emerald Storm. Is that right?" Royce returned in a cutting tone that quieted the room. "The Storm is an Imperial ship, lad," the crooked man told them, "and it's all pressed up. They're only taking seasoned salts now, if there's any room left at all. If you're looking for work, the fishery always needs gutters. That's about as close to seafaring work as is likely for you too." Once more, the room filled with boisterous laughter. Hadrian looked at Royce, who shoved the door open and with a scowl stepped outside. "Thanks for the advice," Hadrian told everyone before following his partner. They sat on the Mackerel's steps, staring at the line of ships across the street. Spires of wood draped with tethered cloth looked like ladies getting dressed for a ball. Hadrian wondered if that was why they always referred to ships as women. "What now?" he asked softly. Royce sat hunched with his chin on his hands. "Thinking," was all he said. Behind them, the door scraped open, and the first thing Hadrian noticed was a wide-brimmed hat with one side pinned up by a lavish blue plume. The face beneath the hat was familiar, and Royce recognized the man immediately. Wyatt Demonthal. Wyatt hesitated as he locked eyes with Royce. He stood with one foot still inside. He did not look surprised to see them, but seemed to be merely questioning the wisdom of advancing, like a child who approached a dog that had unexpectedly growled. For a heartbeat, no one said a word, and then Wyatt gritted his teeth and pulled the door shut behind him. "I can get you on the Storm," he said quickly. Royce narrowed his eyes. "How?" "I'm the helmsman. They're short a cook and can always use another top man. She's ready to sail as soon as the shipment from the palace arrives." "Why?" Wyatt swallowed and his hand absently drifted to his throat. "I know you saw me. You're here to collect, but I don't have the money I owe. Setting you up in Medford was nothing personal. We were starving and Trumbull paid gold. I didn't know they were going to arrest you for the king's murder. I was just hiring you to steal the sword, that's all. 100 gold tenets is a lot of money. And honestly, well, I've never saved that much in my life. And I doubt I ever will. So you think getting us on the Emerald Storm is worth 100 gold?" Wyatt licked his lips, his eyes darting back and forth between them. "I don't know. Is it?" Royce and Hadrian crossed the busy street, dodging carts, and stepped onto the weather decking suspended by ropes. The boards bobbed and weaved beneath their feet. The two were dressed in loose-fitting duck trousers, oversized linen shirts, tarpaulin hats with a bit of ribbon, and neckerchiefs tied in some arcane way that Wyatt had fussed with for some time to get right. They both carried large, heavy cloth sea bags in which they stowed their old clothes, and Hadrian hid his 3 swords. Being unarmed left him feeling off balance and naked. They snaked through the crowded dock, following Wyatt's directions to the end of the pier. The Emerald Storm was a smart-looking, freshly painted ship with 3 masts, 4 decks, and the figurehead of a golden-winged woman ornamenting the bow. Its sails were furled and green pennants flew from each mast. A small army of men hoisted bags of flour and barrels of salted pork onto the deck, where the crew stowed their supplies. Shouts came from what appeared to be an officer who directed the work, and another man who enforced the orders with a stout rattan cane. 2 Imperial soldiers guarded the ramp. "Do you have business here?" one asked at their approach. "Yeah," Hadrian replied with an innocent, hopeful tone. "We're looking for work. Heard the ship was short on hands. We were told to speak with Mr. Temple." "What's this here?" asked a short, heavy-set man with threadbare clothes, bushy eyebrows, and a gruff voice worn to gravel from years of yelling in the salt air. "I'm Temple." "Word is, you're looking to put on a cook," Hadrian said pleasantly. "We are." "Well then, this is your lucky day." "Uh-huh." Temple nodded with a sour look. "And my friend here is an able, top man." "Oh, he is he?" Temple eyed Royce. "We have openings, but only for experienced sailors. Normally, I'd be happy to take on green men, but we can't afford any more landlubbers on this trip. But we are sailors, served on the Endeavor." "Are you now?" the ship's master asked skeptically. "Let me see your hands." "Samitibi." The master examined Hadrian's palms, looking over the various calluses and rough places while grunting occasionally. "You must have spent most of your time in the galley. You've not done any serious rope work." He examined Royce's hands and raised an eyebrow at him. "Have you ever been on a ship before? It's certain you've never handled a sheet or a capstan." "Royce here is a, you know," Hadrian pointed up at the ship's rigging. "The guy who goes up there." The master shook his head and laughed. "If you two are seamen, then I'm the prince of Persepolis." "Oh, but they are, Mr. Temple," a voice declared. Wyatt exited the forecastle and came jogging toward them. A bright white shirt offset his tawny skin and black hair. "I know these men, old mates of mine. The little one is Royce Melbourne, as fine a top man as they come. And the big one is, Hadrian," Royce spoke up. "Right, of course. Hadrian's a fine cook. He is, Mr. Temple." Temple pointed toward Royce. "This one's a top man? Are you joking, Wyatt?" "No, sir. He's one of the best." Temple looked unconvinced. "You could have him prove it to you, sir," Hadrian offered. "You could have him race your best up the ropes." "You mean up the shrouds," Wyatt said, correcting him. "Yeah." "You mean, aye." Hadrian sighed and gave up. The master didn't notice as he'd been focusing on Royce. He sized them up, then shouted, "Durning!" His strong, raspy voice carried well against the ocean wind. Immediately, a tall, thin fellow with leathery skin jogged over. "Aye, sir," he responded respectfully. "This fellow says he can beat you in a race to loose the topsail and back. What do you think?" "I think he's mistaken, sir." "Well, we'll find out." The master turned back to Royce. "I don't actually expect you to beat Durning. Jacob here is one of the best top men I've seen. But if you put in a good showing, the two of you will have jobs aboard. If it turns out you're wasting my time, well, you'll be swimming back. Durning, you take the star aboard. Royce, you have port. We'll begin after Lieutenant Bishop gives permission for us to get underway." Mr. Temple moved towards the quarterdeck, and Wyatt slid down the stair rail to Royce's side. "Remember what I taught you last night, and what Temple said. You don't need to beat Durning." Hadrian clapped Royce on the back, grinning. "So the idea is to just free the sail and get back down alive." Royce nodded and looked apprehensively up at the towering mast before him. "Not afraid of heights, I hope?" Wyatt grinned. "All right, gentlemen," Mr. Temple shouted, addressing the crew from his new position on the quarterdeck. "We're having a contest." He explained the details to the crew as Royce and Jacob moved to the base of the mainsail. Royce looked up with a grimace that drew laughter from the rest. "Seriously, he isn't afraid of heights, is he?" Wyatt asked, looking concerned. "I mean, it looks scary and, well, okay, it is the first few times you go aloft. But it really isn't that hard if you're careful and can handle heights. Hadrian grinned at Wyatt, but all he said was, "I think you're going to like this." An officer appeared on the quarterdeck and stood beside the master. "You may set sail, Mr. Temple." The master turned to the main deck and roared, "Loose the topsail!" Royce appeared, caught by surprise, not realizing this was the order to begin the competition. As a result, Jacob got the jump on him, racing up the ratlines like a monkey. Royce turned but didn't begin climbing. Instead, he watched Jacob's ascent for several seconds. The majority of the crew rooted for Jacob, but a few, perhaps those who had heard they would win a ship's cook if the stranger won, urged Royce to get climbing and called to him like a dog. "Go on, boy. Climb, you damn fool." Some laughed, and a few made disparaging comments about his mother. Royce finally seemed to work something out in his head and leapt to the task. He sprang, clearing the deck by several feet, and began to run rather than climb up the ratlines. It appeared as if Royce was defying gravity as he pumped his legs up the netting, showing no more difficulty than if he were running up a staircase. He had nearly caught up to Jacob by the time he reached the futtock shrouds. Here, the webbing extended away from the mast, reaching towards the small wooden platform known as the masthead. Both men were forced to hang upside down, using the ratlines, and Royce lost momentum, without the ability to go no-handed. Jacob swung around the masthead and jumped to the topmast shroud, where he ascended rapidly once more in monkey form. By the time Royce cleared the masthead, he was well behind Durning. He made up time when he could once again advance without crawling inverted. They reached the yard together, and both ran out along the top of the narrow beam like circus performers. Seeing them balance 100 feet above the deck drew gasps from some of the crew, who gaped in amazement. Royce stopped, pivoting to watch his opponent. Durning threw himself down across the yard, lying on his belly. He reached below for the gaskets to free the bunt lines. Royce quickly imitated him, and together they worked their way across the arm. As they did, the sail came free, revealing its bright white face and dark green crown. It spilled down, whipping in the wind. Royce and Jacob lifted themselves back to their feet and moved to the end of the beam. They each grabbed the brace. The rope connected to the far end of the yard arm and slid to the deck, with the cheers of the crew in their ears. The two touched down together. Mr. Temple shouted to restore order from the unruly crew. It didn't matter who had won. The skillful display by both men had been impressive enough to earn their approval. Even Hadrian found himself clapping, and he noticed Wyatt was staring with his mouth open. Temple nodded at Hadrian and Wyatt. "Stand by at the capstan," Lieutenant Bishop shouted, returning order. "Loose the headsail, hands aloft. Loose the topsail, fore and aft." The crew scattered to their duties. A ring of men surrounded the wooden spoke wheel of the capstan, ready to raise the anchor. Wyatt moved quickly towards the ship's helm, while the rest, Jacob included, climbed the shrouds of the three masts. "And what are you two waiting for?" Mr. Temple asked after Hadrian had joined Royce. "You heard the lieutenant. Get those sails loosed. Hadrian, take station at the capstan." As they trotted to their duties, Mr. Temple gestured in Royce's direction and remarked to Wyatt, "No wonder he doesn't have rough hands. He doesn't use them." The ship's captain appeared on the quarterdeck. He stood beside the lieutenant, his hands clasped behind his back, chest thrust out, and chin set against the salty wind that tugged at the edges of his uniform. Of slightly less than average height, he seemed the opposite of the lieutenant. While Bishop was tall and thin, the captain was short and plump, with a double chin and long hanging cheeks, which quickly flushed red with the wind. He watched the progress of the crew and then nodded to his first officer. Take her out, Mr. Bishop. Raise anchor, the lieutenant bellowed. Wheel hard over, Mum. Hadrian found a place among those at the capstan and pushed against the wooden spokes, rotating the large spool that lifted the anchor from the bottom of the harbor. With the anchor broken out, the wheel hard over, and the forecastle hands drawing at the headsail sheets, the Emerald Storm brought its bow around. As it gained steerage, it moved away from the dock and into the clear of the main channel, and the rigging crew dropped the remaining sails. The great canvases quivered and flapped, snapping in the wind like three violent white beasts. "Hands to the braces," Mr. Temple barked, and the men took hold of the ropes, pulling the yards around until they caught the wind. The sails plumed full as the sea breeze stretched them taut. Hadrian could feel the deck lurch beneath his feet as the Emerald Storm slipped forward through the water, rudder balanced against sail pressure. They traveled down the coast, passing farmers and workers who paused briefly to look at the handsome vessel flying by. At the helm, Wyatt spun the wheel, steering steadily out to sea. The men on the braces trimmed the yards so not a sail fluttered, sending the ship dashing through the waves as it raced from shore. "Course, southwest by south, sir," Wyatt said, updating Temple, who repeated the statement to the lieutenant, who repeated it to the captain, who in turn nodded his approval. The men at the capstan dispersed, leaving Hadrian looking around for something to do. Royce descended to the deck beside him, neither one certain of his duty now that the ship was underway. It didn't matter much as the lieutenant, the captain, and Temple were all busy on the quarter deck. The other hands moved casually now, cleaning up the rigging, finishing the job of stowing the supplies, and generally settling in. "Why didn't we ever consider sailing as a profession?" Hadrian asked Royce as he moved to the side and faced the wind. He took a deep, satisfying breath, then smiled. "This is nice. A lot better than a sweaty, fly-plagued horse. And look at the land go by. How fast do you think we're going?" "The fact that we're trapped here with no chance of retreat, except into the ocean, doesn't bother you." Hadrian glanced over the side at the heaving waves. "Well, not until now. Why do you always have to ruin everything? Couldn't you let me enjoy the moment?" "You know me. Just trying to keep things in perspective. Our course is south. Any clue where we might be going?" Royce shook his head. "It only means we aren't invading Melangar, but we could be heading just about anywhere else. Someone arriving deckside caught us attention." "Who's this now?" A man in red and black appeared from below and climbed the stair to the quarter deck. He stood out from the rest of the crew by virtue of his pale skin and silken vestments, which were far too elegant for the setting and whipped about like streamers at a fair. He moved, hunched over, his slumped shoulders reminding Hadrian of a crow shuffling along a branch. He sported a mustache and short goatee. His dark hair, combed back, emphasized the dramatically receding hairline. "Broken crown crest," Hadrian noted. "Siretta." "Red cassock," Royce added. "Sentinel." "At least he's not Luis Guy. It'd be pretty hard to hide on a ship this size." "If it was Guy," Royce smiled wickedly, "we wouldn't need to hide." Hadrian noticed Royce glance over the side of the ship at the water, which foamed and churned as it rushed past. "If a sentinel is on board," Royce continued, "we can assume there are Siret as well. They never travel alone. Maybe below. Maybe disguised in the crew," Royce cautioned. To starboard, a sailor dropped his burden on the deck and wiped the sweat from his brow with a rag. Noticing them standing idle, he walked over. "You're good," he said to Royce. "No man's beaten Jacob aloft before." The sailor was tan and thin, with a tattoo of a woman on his forearm and a ring of silver in his ear. "I didn't beat him. "We landed together," Royce said, correcting him. "Aye, clever, that. My name's Grady. What do they call you?" "Royce. And this is Hadrian." "Oh yeah, the cook." Grady gave Hadrian a nod, and then returned his attention. "Royce, huh? I'm surprised I haven't heard your name before. With skills like you got, I would have figured you'd be famous. What ships have you served on?" "None around these waters," Royce replied. Grady looked at him curiously. "Where then?" "The Sound, Dagestan, the Sharon. Try me. I've been around a few places myself." "Sorry, I'm really bad at remembering names." Grady's eyebrows rose. "You don't remember the names of the ships you served on?" "I would prefer not to discuss them." "Aye, consider the subject closed." He looked at Hadrian. "You were with him, then?" "We've worked together for some time." Grady nodded. "Just forget I said anything. I won't be getting in the way. You can bank money on Grady's word, too." The man winked, then walked away, glancing back over his shoulder at them a few times as he went off, grinning. "Seems like a nice sort," Hadrian said. "Strange and confusing, but nice. You think he knows why we're here?" "Wish he did," Royce replied, watching Grady resume work. "Then he could tell us. Still, I've found that when hunting Merrick, stranger things have been known to happen. One thing's for certain, this trip is going to be interesting." Chapter 5. Broken Silence. Although it was early, Nimbus was already waiting outside the closed door of Amelia's office with armloads of parchments. He smiled brightly at her approach. "Good morning, your ladyship," he greeted her, with as much of a bow as he could manage without spilling his burden. "Beautiful day, is it not?" Amelia grunted in reply. She wasn't a morning person, and that day's agenda included a meeting with Regent Saldo. If anything was likely to ruin her day, that would do it. She opened her office door with a key kept on a chain around her neck. The office was a reward for the successful presentation of the Empress nearly a month before. Medina had been near death when Saldu had appointed Amelia Imperial Secretary to the Empress. At that time, the young ruler had not spoken a word, was dangerously thin, and had an unwavering expression, which was never more than a blank stare. Amelia had provided her with better living conditions and worked hard to get her to eat. After several months, the girl had begun to improve. Medina had managed to memorize a short speech for the day of her presentation, but abandoned the prepared text and publicly singled out Amelia, proclaiming her a hero. No one had been more shocked than Amelia, but Salda thought she had been responsible. Rather than exploding in anger, he congratulated her. Since that day, his attitude toward Amelia had changed, as if she had bought admission into the exclusive club of the deviously ambitious. In his eyes, she had not only been capable of manipulating the mentally unbalanced ruler, but willing to do so as well. This raised opinion of her had been followed by additional responsibilities and a new title, Chief Imperial Secretary to the Empress. She took her directions from Saldo as Medina remained locked in the dark recesses of her madness. One of her new responsibilities was reading and replying to mail addressed to the Empress. Saldu gave her the task as soon as he discovered she could read and write. Amelia also received the responsibility of being the Empress's official gatekeeper. She decided who could and who could not have an audience with Medina. Normally a position of extreme power, hers was just a farce, because absolutely no one ever saw Medina. Despite Amelia's grandiose new title, her office was a small chamber with nothing but an old desk and a pair of bookshelves. The room was cold, damp, and sparse. but it was hers. She had filled with pride each morning when she sat behind the desk, and pride was something Amelia was unaccustomed to. "Are those more letters?" Amelia asked. "Yes, I'm afraid so," Nimbus replied. "Where would you like them?" "Just drop them on the pile with the others. I can see now why Saldo gave me this job." "It is a very prestigious task," Nimbus assured her. "You are the de facto voice of the new empire as it relates to the people. What you write is taken as the word of the Empress, and thus the voice of a god incarnate." "So, you're saying I'm the voice of God now?" Nimbus smiled thoughtfully. "In a manner of speaking, yes." "You have a crazy way of seeing things, Nimbus. You really do." He was always able to cheer her up. His outlandishly colored clothes and silly powdered wig made her smile on even the bleakest of days. Moreover, the odd little courtier had a bizarre manner of finding joy in everything, blind to the inevitable disaster that Amelia knew lurked at every turn. Nimbus deposited the letters in the bin beside Amelia's desk, then fished out a tablet and looked it over briefly before speaking. "You have a meeting this morning with Lady Rashenbow, Baroness Fargle, and Countess Riedel. They have insisted on speaking to you personally about their failed petitions to have a private audience with Her Supreme Eminence. You also have a dedication to make on behalf of the Empress at the new memorial in Capitol Square. That is at noon. Also, the material has arrived, but you still need to get specifications to the seamstress for the new dress. And of course, you have a meeting this afternoon with Regent Saldo. Any idea what he wants to see me about?" Nimbus shook his head. Amelia slumped in her chair. She was certain Saldo's appointment had to do with Medina's berating of the clerk the previous day. She had no idea how to explain the Empress's actions. That had been the only time since her speech that Medina had uttered a single word. "Would you like me to help you answer those?" Nimbus asked with a sympathetic smile. "No, I'll do it. Can't have both of us playing God, now can we? Besides, you have your own work. Tell the seamstress to meet me in Medina's chambers in 4 hours. That should give me time to reduce this pile some. Reschedule the ladies of the court meeting to just before noon." "But you have the dedication at noon." "Exactly. Excellent planning," Nimbus said, praising her. "Is there anything else I can do for you before I get to work?" Amelia shook her head. Nimbus bowed and left. The pile beside her got higher each day. She plucked a letter from the top and started working. While not a difficult job, the task was repetitious and boring as she said the same thing in each reply. "The Office of the Empress regrets to inform you that our most serene and royal Grand Imperial Eminence, Empress Modena Navronian, will not be able to receive you due to time constraints caused by important and pressing matters of state." She'd replied to only 7 of the letters when there was a soft knock at the door. A maid hesitantly popped her head inside. The new girl. She had started only the day before, and she worked quietly, which Amelia appreciated. Amelia nodded an invitation, and the maid wordlessly slipped inside with her bucket, mop, and cleaning tools, taking great pains not to bang them against the door. Amelia recalled her own days as a servant in the castle. As a kitchen worker, she had rarely cleaned rooms, but occasionally had to fill in for a sick chambermaid. She used to loathe working in a room with a noble present. It always made her self-conscious and frightened. She could never tell what they might do. One minute they might seem friendly, the next they could be calling for you to be whipped. Amelia had never understood how they could be so capricious and cruel. She watched the girl set about her work. The maid was on her hands and knees, scrubbing the floor with a brush, the skirt of her uniform soaked with soapy water. Amelia had a stack of inquiries to attend to, but the maid distracted her. She felt guilty not acknowledging the girl's presence. It felt rude. "I should talk to her." Even as Amelia thought this, she knew it would be a mistake. This new girl saw her as a noble, the chief imperial secretary to the Empress, and would be terrified if Amelia so much as offered a good morning. Perhaps a few years older than Amelia, the girl was slender and pretty, although little could be determined given her attire. She wore a loose-fitting dress with a canvas apron, her figure hidden, a mystery lost beneath the folds. All serving girls adopted this style, except the foolish or ambitious. When you worked in the halls of those who took whatever they wanted, it was best to avoid notice. Amelia tried to decide if the girl were married. After Medina's speech, the ban on servants leaving the castle had been lifted, and it was possible that the maid had a family in the city. She wondered if she went home to them each night or, like Amelia, she had left everything and everyone to live in the castle. She likely had several children, pretty peasant girls married young. Amelia chided herself for watching the maid instead of working, but something about the girl kept her attention. The way she moved and how she held her head seemed out of place. She watched her dab the brush in the water and stroke the floor, moving the brush from side to side like a painter. She spread water around, but did little to free the dirt from the surface. Edith Mon would whip her for that. The headmistress was a cruel taskmaster. Amelia had found herself on the wrong side of her belt on a number of occasions for lesser infractions. For that alone, Amelia felt sorry for the poor girl. She knew all too well what she faced. "Are they treating you well here?" Amelia found herself asking, despite her determination to remain silent. The girl looked up and glanced around the room. "Yes, you," Amelia assured her. "Yes, milady," the maid replied, looking up. "She's looking right at me," Amelia thought, stunned. Even with her title and a rank equivalent to Baroness, Amelia still had a hard time returning the stare of even the lowest-ranking nobles. But this girl was looking right at her. "You can tell me if they aren't. I know what it's like to—" She stopped, realizing the maid would not believe her. "I understand new servants can be picked on and belittled by the others." "I'm getting along fine, milady," she said. Amelia smiled, trying to set her at ease. "I didn't mean to suggest you weren't. I'm very pleased with you. I just know it can be hard sometimes when you start out in a new place. I want you to know that I can help if you're having trouble." "Thank you," she said. But Amelia heard the suspicion in her voice. Having a noble offer to help with bullying peers was probably a shock to the girl. If it had been her, Amelia would have thought it a trap of some kind. A test, perhaps, to see if she would speak ill of others. If she admitted to problems, the noble might have her removed from the palace. Under no circumstances would Amelia have admitted anything to a noble, no matter how kindly the woman might have presented herself. Amelia instantly felt foolish. There was a division between nobles and commoners, and for good or ill she was now on the other side. The conditioning that separated the two was far too entrenched for her to wipe away. She decided to stop tormenting the poor girl and return to her work. Just then, however, the maid put down the scrub brush and stood. "Your Lady Amelia, is that right?" "Yes," she replied, surprised at the sudden forwardness. "You're the chief secretary to the Empress? How well informed you are. It's good that you're learning your way around. It took me quite some time to figure out." "How is she?" Amelia hesitated. Interrupting was very inappropriate, and it was incredibly bold to inquire so bluntly about her eminence. Amelia was touched, however, by her concern for the welfare of Modena. Perhaps this girl was unaccustomed to interacting with the gentry. She was likely from some isolated village that never had seen a visiting noble. The unnerving way she held Amelia's stare revealed she had no experience with proper social etiquette. Edith Mahan would waste no time beating those lessons into her. "She's fine," Amelia replied. Then, as a matter of habit, she added, "She was ill, and still is, but getting better every day." "I never see her," the maid went on. "I've seen you, the Chancellor, the Regents, and the Lord Chamberlain, but I never see her in the halls or at the banquet table. She guards her privacy. You have to understand that everyone wants time with the Empress. I guess she gets around using secret passages." "Secret passages?" Amelia chuckled at the imagination of this girl. "No, she doesn't use secret passages. But I heard this palace is very old and filled with hidden stairs and corridors that lead to all kinds of secret places. Is that true?" "I don't know anything about that," Amelia replied. "What got this into your head?" The maid immediately put a hand over her mouth in embarrassment. Her eyes dropped to the floor in submission. "Forgive me, my lady. I didn't mean to be so bold. I'll get back to my work now." "That's all right," Amelia replied as the maid dunked her brush again. "What's your name, dear?" "Ella, my lady," the maid replied softly without pausing or looking up. "Well, Ella, if you have problems or other questions, you have permission to speak to me." "Thank you, my lady. That's very kind of you." Amelia returned to her own work and left the maid to hers. In a short time, the servant finished and gathered her things to leave. "Goodbye, Ella," Amelia offered. The maid smiled at the mention of her name and nodded appreciatively. As she walked out, Amelia glanced at her hands, which gripped the bucket handle and the mop, and was surprised to see long fingernails on them. Ella noticed her glance, shifted her grip to cover her nails, and promptly left the chamber. Amelia stared after her a while, wondering how a working girl could manage to grow nails as nice as hers. She put the thought out of her mind and returned to her letters. "You realize they're going to get wise," Amelia said after the seamstress had finished taking Modena's measurements and left the chamber. The chief secretary moved around the Empress's bedroom, straightening up. Modena sat beneath the narrow window in the only patch of sunshine, entering the room. This was where Amelia found her most often. She would sit there for hours, just staring outside, watching clouds and birds. It broke Amelia's heart a little each time she saw her longing for a world barred to her. The Empress showed no response to Amelia's comment. Her lucidity from the day before had vanished. The Empress heard her, though. She was quite certain of that now. "They aren't stupid," she went on as she fluffed a pillow. "After your speech and that incident with the clerk yesterday, I think it's only a matter of time. You'd have been wiser to stay in your room and let me handle it." "He wasn't going to listen to you," the Empress spoke. Amelia dropped the pillow. Turning as casually as she could, she stole a glance over her shoulder to see Modena still looking out the window with her traditional vague and distant expression. Amelia slowly picked up the pillow and resumed her straightening. Then she ventured, "It might have taken a little time, but I'm certain I could have persuaded him to provide us with the material." Amelia waited, holding her breath, listening. Silence. Just when she was certain it had only been one of her rare outbursts of coherency, Modena spoke again. "He never would have given in to you. You're scared of him, and he knows that." "And you aren't?" Again, silence. Amelia waited. "I'm not afraid of anything anymore," the Empress finally replied, her voice distant and thin. "Maybe not afraid, but it would bother you if they took the window away." "Yes," Modena said simply. Amelia watched as the Empress closed her eyes and turned her face full into the light of the sun. "If Saldor discovers your masquerade, if he thinks you've just been acting insane and misleading the regions for over a year, It might frighten him into locking you up where you can't do any harm. They could put you in a dark hole somewhere and leave you there. I know, Modena said, her eyes still closed and head tilted upward. Immersed in the daylight, she appeared almost to glow. But I won't let them hurt you. The words took a moment to register with Amelia. She had heard them clearly enough, but their meaning came so unexpectedly that she sat on the bed without realizing it. As she thought back, it should have been obvious, but not until that moment did she realize what Modena had done. The Empress's speech had been for Amelia's benefit, to ensure that Ethelred and Saldor couldn't have her removed or killed. Few people had ever gone out of their way for Amelia. The concept that Modena, the crazy Empress, had risked her life in this way was unimaginable. Such an event was as likely as the wind changing direction to suit her or the sun asking her permission to shine. "Thank you," was all she could think to say. For the first time, she felt awkward in Modena's presence. "I'm going to go now." She headed for the door. As her hand touched the latch, Modena spoke again. "It isn't completely an act, you know." Waiting inside the Regent's office, Amelia realized she hadn't heard a word in her meeting with the ladies or during the dedication later that morning. Dumbfounded by her conversation with Modena, by the mere fact that she had actually had a conversation with Modena, she registered little else. Her distraction, however, vanished the instant Saldor arrived. The Regent appeared imposing as always, in his elegant robe and cape of purple and black. His white hair and lined face lent him a grandfatherly appearance, but his eyes held no warmth. "Afternoon, Amelia," he said, walking past her and taking a seat at his desk. The Regent's office was dramatically opulent. 10 times larger than hers, it featured an elegant decor. A fine patterned rug covered the polished hardwood and numerous end tables flanked couches and armchairs. On one table sat an elaborately carved chest set. The fireplace was an impressively wide hearth of finely chiseled marble. There were decanters of spirits on the shelves along with thick books. Religious-themed paintings lined the spaces between the bookcases and the windows. One illustrated the familiar scene of Maribor anointing Novron. The immense desk behind which Saldo sat was a dark mahogany, polished to a fine luster and adorned with a bouquet of fresh flowers. The entire office was perfumed with a heady scent of incense, the kind Amelia had smelled only once before, when visiting a cathedral. "Your Grace," Amelia replied respectfully. "Sit down, my dear," Saldo said. Amelia found a chair and mechanically sat. Every muscle in her body was tense. She wished Modena hadn't spoken to her that morning. Then she could honestly plead ignorance. Amelia was no good at lying and had no idea how she should respond to Saldo's interrogation in order to bring the least amount of punishment to her and the Empress. She was still debating what she might say when Saldo spoke. "I've some news for you," he said, folding his hands on the surface of the desk and leaning forward. "It won't be public for several weeks, but you need to know now so you can begin preparations. I want you to keep this to yourself until I announce it. Do you understand?" Amelia nodded as if she understood. In almost 4 months, during the Wintertide celebrations, Modena will marry Regent Ethelred. I don't think I need to impress upon you the importance of this occasion. The Patriarch himself is personally coming to perform the ceremony. All eyes will be on this palace and on the Empress. Amelia said nothing and barely managed another shallow nod. "It's your charge to ensure that nothing embarrassing occurs. I've been very pleased with your work to date, and as a result, I'm giving you an opportunity to excel further. I'm putting you in charge of arranging the ceremony. It'll be your responsibility to develop a guest list and prepare invitations. Go to the Lord Chamberlain for help with that. You'll also need to coordinate with the palace cooks for meals. I understand you have a good relationship with the head cook." Once more, she nodded. "Wonderful. There should be decorations, entertainment, music, certainly, and perhaps a magician or a troupe of acrobats. The ceremony will take place here in the Great Hall. That should make things a bit easier for you. You'll also need to have a wedding dress made, one worthy of the Empress." Seeing the tension on her face, Saldo added, "Relax, Amelia. This time you only need to get her to say 2 words. I do." Chapter 6, The Emerald Storm. As the ship lurched once more, Hadrian stumbled and nearly hit his head on the overhead beam. It would have been his 3rd time that day. The lower decks of the Emerald Storm provided meager headroom and precious little light. An obstacle course of sea chests, ditty bags, crude wooden benches, tables that swung from ropes, and close to 130 men was crammed into the berth deck. Hadrian made his way aft, dodging the majority of the starboard watch, most of whom were asleep, swaying in hammocks, strung from the same wooden crossbeams on which Hadrian had nearly cracked a skull. The clutter and the shifting of the ship were not the only things making Hadrian stagger. He had been feeling nauseated since sunset. The Emerald Storm had been at sea for nearly 15 hours, and the enigma of life aboard ship was slowly revealing itself. Hadrian had spent many years in the company of professional soldiers and recognized that each branch of the military held its own jargon, traditions, and idiosyncrasies, but he'd never set foot on a ship. He knew he could be certain of only 2 things. He had a lot of learning to do, and he had little time to do it. He'd already picked up several important pieces of information, such as where to relieve himself, which to his surprise was at the head of the ship. A precarious experience as he had to hang out over the sea at the base of the bowsprit. This might be second nature to sailors and easy for Royce, but it gave Hadrian pause. Another highly useful discovery was a cursory understanding about the chain of command. Hadrian determined that the officers, noblemen mostly, were skilled tradesmen and held a higher rank than the general seamen, but he could also tell there were substrata within these broad classes. There were different ranks of officers and even more subtle levels of seniority, influence, and jurisdiction. He couldn't expect to penetrate such a complex hierarchy on his first day, but he had managed to determine that the bosun and his mates were the ones charged with making sure the seamen did their jobs. They were quite persuasive with their short rope whips, and kept a keen eye on the crew at all times. Because of this, they were the ones he watched. The ship's crew divided into 2 watches. While one worked the ship, the other rested, slept, or ate. Lieutenant Bishop had placed Royce on the starboard watch, assigned to the main top. His job was to work the rigging on the center mast. This put him under Bosun Bristol Bennett and his 3 mates. Hadrian had seen their like before. Drunks, vagrants, and thugs. They would never have amounted to much on land. But aboard ship, they held power and status. The chance to repay others for any mistreatment they had experienced made them cruel and quick to punish. Hadrian still waited to discover his watch assignment, but he hoped it would be the same as Royce's. He'd been lucky so far. This being the first day out, preparing meals had been little more than placing out fresh foods from the recent stay at port. Fruit, fresh bread, and salted meats were merely handed out, with no cooking required. Consequently, Hadrian's talents remained untested, but time was running out. He knew how to cook, of course. He had prepared meals for years using little more than a campfire, but that had mainly been for him and Royce. He didn't know how to cook for an entire ship's crew. Needing to find out exactly what they expected drove him to wander in hopes of finding weird. "The Princess of Melangar rules there now," Hadrian heard a young lad say. He didn't look to be much more than 16. He was the life of a boy with thin whiskers, freckles darkened by days in the sun, and curly hair cut in a bow-like fashion, except for a short ponytail he tied back with a black cord. He sat with Weird, Grady, and a few other men around a swaying table illuminated by a candle melted into the center of a copper plate. They were playing cards, and the giant shadows they cast only made Hadrian's approach more disorienting. "She doesn't rule Ratibor. She's the mayor," Weirdy said, correcting the boy as he laid a card on the pile before him. "What's the difference?" "She was appointed, lad." "What's that mean?" the boy asked as he tried to decide which card to play, holding his hands so tight to his chest he could barely see the cards himself. "It means she didn't just take over. The people of the city asked her to run things. But she can still execute people, right? I suppose. Sounds like a ruler to me." With a wide grin, the boy laid a card, indicating that he thought it was a surprisingly good play. "Sounds like them people of Ratibor are dumb as dirt," Grady said gruffly. His expression betrayed his irritation at the boy's discard. "They finally get the yoke off their backs, and right away they ask for a new one." "Grady," said a man with a white kerchief on his head. "I'm from Ratibor, you oaf." "Exactly. Thanks for proving me point, Bernie," Grady replied, slamming his play on the table so hard several surrounding seamen groaned in their hammocks. Grady laughed at his own joke, and the rest of the table chuckled good-naturedly, except Bernie from Ratibor. "Hadrian," Weird greeted him warmly as the new cook staggered up to them like a drunk. "We were just talking about land affairs. Most of these poor sods haven't been ashore in over a year, and we were filling them in on the news about the war, which has been bloody cracking seeing as how we didn't even know there was one," Grady said, feigning indignation. "We were just in dock, though," Hadrian said. "I would have thought." "That don't mean nothing," one of the other men said. With next to no hair and a few teeth, he appeared to be the oldest at the table, and possibly the entire ship. He had a silver earring that glinted with the candlelight, and a tattoo of a mermaid that wrapped around his forearm. He, too, wore a white kerchief on his head. "Most of this here crew is pressed. The captain would be balmy to let them touch solid ground in a port. He and Mr. Bishop would be the only ones left to rigor." This brought a round of laughter and garnered irritated growls from those trying to sleep. "You don't look so good," Weird mentioned to Hadrian. He shook his head miserably. "It's been a long time since I've been on a ship. Does the storm always rock so much?" Weird glanced at him, then laughed. This here is nothing. You won't even notice it in a day or so." He watched the next man at the table play his card. "We're still in the Sound. Wait until we hit the open sea. You might want to sit. You're sweating." Hadrian touched his face and felt the moisture. "Funny. I feel chilled, if anything." "Have a seat," Weird said. "Poe, give him your spot." "Why me?" the young boy asked, insulted. "Because I said so." Poe's expression showed that was not enough for him to give up one of the limited places. "And because I'm a quartermaster and you're a seaman, but even more importantly, because Mr. Bishop appointed you cook's mate." "He did?" Poe asked, and blinked, a smile crossing his face. "Congratulations," Weird said. "Now you might want to make a good impression on your new boss and move your infernal arse." The boy promptly stood and pretended to clean the bench with an invisible duster. "After you, sir," he said with an exaggerated bow. "Does he know anything about cooking?" Hadrian asked dubiously, taking the seat. Sure, Poe declared exuberantly. "I know plenty. You just wait. I'll show you." Good. I don't feel up to working with food yet. Hadrian let his head drop into his hands. The old man next to Weirde tossed down his card, and the whole group groaned in agony. "You bloody bastard, Drew!" Grady barked at him, tossing what remained of his cards onto the pile. The others did the same. Drew grinned, showing his few yellowed teeth, and collected the tiny pile of silver tenets. "That's it for me, boys. Good night." "Night, Drew, you lousy lank steer," Grady said, shooing him away as if he were a bug. "We can talk at breakfast, eh?" "Sure, Grady," Drew said. "Oh, that reminds me. I heard something right funny tonight when I was reefing the topsail. We're going to be taking on a passenger to help find the horn. How stupid are these landlubbers? It's only the most well-known point on the Sharon. Anyway, remind me at breakfast, and I'll tell you about it. It's a real hoot. It is. Night now." Most of the rest of the men headed off, leaving just Weirde, Grady, Poe, and Hadrian. "You should turn in as well," Weirde told Poe. "I'm not tired," he protested. "I didn't ask if you were tired, did I? I want to stay up and celebrate my promotion. Off with you before I report you for disobeying a superior." Poe scowled and stomped off, looking for his hammock. "You too, Grady," Weirde told him. The old seaman looked at Weirde suspiciously, then leaned over and quietly asked, "Why are you trying to get rid of me, de Montal?" "Because I'm tired of looking at that ugly scowl of yours, that's why." "Codswallop," he hissed. "You want to be alone to talk about the you-know-what, don't you? Both of you are in on it, I can tell. And that Royce fella, he's in too. How many more you got, Weird? Room for another? I'm pretty good in a fight." "Shut up, Grady," Weird told him. "Talk like that can get you hanged." Okay, Grady said, holding up his palms. "Just letting you know, that's all." He got up and headed for his own hammock, casting several glances back over his shoulder until he disappeared into the forest of swinging men. "What was all that about?" Hadrian asked, hooking a thumb toward Grady's retreating figure. "I don't know," Wyatt replied. "There's always one sailor on board any ship looking for a mutiny. Grady seems to be the Emerald Storm's. Ever since he signed on, he's been thinking there's a conspiracy going on. Mostly because he wants there to be, I think. He has issues with authority. Grady does." Wyatt started gathering up the scattered deck of cards into a pile. "So what's your story?" "How do you mean?" Hadrian asked. "Why are you and Royce here? I stuck my neck out getting you on board. I think I have a right to know why." "I thought you got us on board to pay off a debt." "True, but I'm still curious why you wanted on the Storm in the first place." "We're looking for a safer line of work, and I thought we'd try sailing," Hadrian offered. Wyatt's face showed he was not buying it. "We're on a job, but I can't tell you more than that." "Does it have to do with the secret cargo?" Hadrian blinked. "It's possible. What is the secret cargo?" "Weapons, steel swords, heavy shields, Imperial-made crossbows, armor, enough to outfit a good-sized army. It came aboard at the last minute, hauled up in the middle of the night just before we sailed." "Interesting," Hadrian mused. "Any idea where we're headed?" "Nope, but that's not unusual. Captains usually keep that information to themselves, and Captain Seward doesn't even share that with me, and I'm the quartermaster." "Quartermaster? I thought you were the helmsman." "I'm guessing you've served in armies, haven't you?" "A few. The quartermaster is the supply officer. But on the sea, the quartermaster steers the ship, and as I mentioned, the captain hasn't even told me where we're going." Wyatt shuffled the cards absently. So you don't know where the ship is going, and you weren't aware of the cargo. This job didn't come with much in the way of information, did it? What about you? Hadrian turned the tables. What are you doing here? I could say I was working for a living, and for me it would actually make sense. But like you, I'm looking for answers. To what? To where my daughter is. Wyatt paused a moment, his eyes glancing at the candle. Allie was taken a week ago. I was out finding work, and while I was gone, the imps grabbed her. Grabbed her? Why? Wyatt lowered his voice. Allie is part elven, and the new empire is not partial to their kind. Under a new law, anyone with even a drop of elf blood is subject to arrest. They've been rounding them up and putting them on ships, but no one can tell me where they've taken them. So here I am. But what makes you think this ship will go to the same place? I take it you haven't ventured down to the waste hold yet. He paused a second, then added, "That's the bottom of the ship, below the waterline. Ship's stores are there, as well as livestock like goats, chickens, and cows. Sailors on report get the duty to pump the bilge. It's a miserable job on account of the manure mixing with the seawater that leaks in. It's also where, right now, more than 100 elves are chained up in an area half this size." Hadrian nodded with a grimace at the thought. "You and Royce gave me a break once, because of my daughter." "Why was that?" "That was Royce's call. You need to take that up with him, although I wouldn't do it for a while. He's sicker than I am. I've never seen him so miserable. And this sea business is making him irritable. Well, more irritable than usual." Wyatt nodded. "My daughter's the same way on water. Pitiful little thing. She's like a cat on a piece of driftwood. It takes her forever to get accustomed to the rocking." He paused a moment, looking at the candle. "I'm sure you'll find her. Don't worry." Hadrian glanced at the massive men around him and lowered his voice to a whisper. "The job we're on is important. We can't afford to be distracted. If the situation presents itself, we'll help any way we can. Something tells me I won't have much trouble convincing Royce." Hadrian felt the nausea rising to his stomach once more. His face must have betrayed his misery. "Don't worry. Seasickness usually only lasts 3 days," Wyatt assured him as he put the cards in his breast pocket. "After that, both of you will be fine. If we can stay on board that long, I don't know anything about being a ship's cook." Wyatt smiled. "Don't worry, I've got you covered. Poe will do most of the work. I know he looks young, but he'll surprise you." "So, how is it that I get an assistant? As ship's cook, you rank as a petty officer. Don't get all excited, though. You're still under the bosuns and their mates. But it does grant you the services of ordinary seaman POW. It also exempts you from the watches. That means so long as the ship's meals are on schedule, the rest of your time is your own. What you need to know is that breakfast is served promptly at the first bell of the forewatch." Wyatt paused. "That's the first time you'll hear a single bell toll after 8 bells is rung just after the sun breaks above the horizon. So have Poe light the galley fires shortly after middle watch. You'll know when that is. Tell him to make skilligalee, that's oatmeal gruel. Don't forget biscuits. Biscuits get served at every meal. At 8 bells, the men are piped to breakfast. Each mess will send someone to you with a mess kid, sort of like a wooden bucket. Your job will be to dish out the food. Have Poe make some tea as well. The men will drink beer and rum at dinner and supper, but not at breakfast. And no one on board will risk drinking straight water." Risk? Water sits in barrels for months or years if the ship is on a long voyage. It gets rancid. Tea and coffee are okay, because they're boiled and have a little flavor. Coffee is expensive, though, and reserved for the officers. The crew and the midshipmen eat first. After that, Basil, the officer's cook, will arrive to make meals for the lieutenants and captain. Just stay out of his way. For dinner, make boiled pork. Have Poe start boiling it right after Basil leaves. The salted meat will throw off a thick layer of fat. Half of that goes to the top captains to grease the rigging. The other half you can keep. You can sell it to tallow merchants at the next port for a bit of coin. But don't give it to the men. It will make you popular if you do. But it can also give them scurvy, and the captain won't like it. Have Poe boil some vegetables and serve them together as a stew. And don't forget the biscuits. So I tell Poe what to make and dish it out. But I don't actually do any cooking. Wyatt smiled. That's the benefit of being a petty officer. Sadly, however, you only get a seaman's rate of pay. For supper, just serve what's left over from dinner, grog, and of course biscuits. After that, have Poe clean up. And like I said, the rest of the day is open to you. Sound easy? Maybe if I could stand straight and keep my stomach from doing backflips. Listen to Poe. He'll take good care of you. Now you'd best get back to your hammock. Trust me, it helps. Oh, and just so you know, you would have been wrong. About what? Hadrian asked. About thinking sailing was a safer line of work. It was still dark when the captain called. All hands. A cold wind had risen, and in the dark hours before dawn, a light rain sprayed the deck, adding a wet chill to the seasick misery that had already deprived Hadrian of most of his sleep. During the night, the Emerald Storm had passed by the Isle of Neil and now approached the Point of Man. The point was a treacherous headland shoal that marked the end of Avron Bay and the start of the Sharon Sea. In the dark, it was difficult to see the shoal, but the sound was unmistakable. From somewhere ahead, there came the rhythmic, thundering boom of waves crashing against the point. The below decks emptied as the boatswain and his mates roused all the men from both watches with their starter ropes, driving them up to stations. "Bring her about," shouted the captain from his perch on the quarter-deck. The dignified figure of Lieutenant Bishop echoed the order, which Mr. Temple repeated. "Hell moly," shouted the captain. Once more the order echoed across the decks. Wyatt spun the ship's great wheel. "Tacks and sheets," Lieutenant Bishop barked to the crew. At the mizzen, main, and foremasts, the other lieutenants shouted more orders, which the boatswains reinforced. Hadrian stood on the main deck in the dark and drizzling rain, unsure of his station, or even if he had one. He was a cook, after all, but it seemed even a cook was expected to lend a hand on deck when necessary. He still felt ill, but Royce appeared worse. Hadrian watched as Boatswain Bristol, a big burly man, ordered him up the ropes, waving his short whip menacingly. Drained of color, Royce's face and hands stood out pale in the dark. His eyes were unfocused and empty. He reluctantly moved up the mainmast's ratlines, but he didn't display any of the acrobatics of the previous day. Instead, he crawled miserably and hesitated partway up. He hovered in the wet rigging as if he might fall. From below, Bristol cursed at him, until at last he moved upward once more. Hadrian imagined that the higher into the rigging Royce went, the more pronounced the sway of the ship would be. Between that, the slippery wet ropes, and the cold wind-driven rain, he didn't envy his friend. Several of the men were working the ropes that controlled the direction of the sails, but others, like him, remained idle, waiting in lines which the boatswains formed. There was a tension evident in the silence of the crew. The booming of the headlands grew louder and closer, sounding like the pounding of a giant's hammer or the heartbeat of a god. They seemed to be flying blindly into the maw of some enormous unseen beast that would swallow them whole. The reality, Hadrian imagined, wouldn't be much different should they come too close to the shoal. Anticipating something, all eyes watched the figure of Captain Seward. Hadrian could tell by the feel of the wind and the direction of the rain that the ship was turning. The sails, once full and taut, began to flutter and collapsed as the bow crossed over into the face of the wind. "Mainsail haul!" the captain suddenly shouted, and the crew cast off the bowlines and braces. Seeing the movements, Hadrian realized the strategy. They were attempting a windward tack around the dangerous point, which meant the wind would be blowing the ship's hull toward the treacherous rocks, even as they struggled to reset the sails to catch the wind from the other side. The danger came from the lack of maneuverability caused by empty sails during the tack. Without the wind driving the ship, the rudder couldn't push against the water and turn it. If the ship could not come about fully, it would not be able to catch the wind again, and it would drift into the shoal, which would shatter the timbered hull like an eggshell and cast the cargo and crew into a dark, angry sea. Hadrian took hold of the rope in his line, and along with several others, pulled the yards round, repositioning the sails to catch the wind as soon as they were able. The rope was slick, and the wind jerked the coils so roughly that it took the whole line to pull the yards safely into position. There was another deafening boom, and a burst of white spray shot skyward as the breaking water exploded over the port bow. The vessel was turning fast now, pulling away from the foam, struggling to get clear. No sooner had the boat cleared the wind than he heard the captain order, "Now meet her hard over." His voice was nearly lost as another powerful wave rammed the rocks just beside them, throwing the Emerald Storm's bow upward with a rough lurch that staggered them all. On the quarterdeck, Wyatt followed the order, spinning the wheel back, checking the swing before the ship could turn too far and lose its stern in the rocks. Overhead, Hadrian heard a scream. Looking up, he saw the figure of a man fall from the mainsail rigging. His body landed a dozen steps away with a sickening thud. All eyes looked at the prone figure lying like a dark stain on the deck, but none dared move from their stations. Hadrian strained to see who it was. The man lay face down, and in the dim light, it was difficult to tell anything. "Is that Royce?" Normally, he would never have questioned his friend's climbing skills, but with his sickness, the motion of the ship, and his inexperience, it was possible he could have slipped. "Haul off all!" Mr. Temple shouted, ignoring the fallen man. The crew pulled on the sheets and braces and once more captured the wind. The sails bloomed full, and Hadrian felt the lurch under his feet as the ship burst forward once more, heaving into the waves, now steering out to the open sea. "Dr. Levy on deck!" Bishop shouted. Hadrian rushed over the instant he could, but stopped short on seeing the tattoo of the mermaid on the dead man's forearm. "It's Edgar Drew, sir." "He's dead, sir!" Bristol shouted to the quarterdeck as he knelt next to the fallen man. Several sailors gathered around the body, glancing upward at the mainsail shrouds, until the bosun's mates took them to task. Hadrian thought he could see Royce up near the top yard, but in the dark he couldn't be sure. Still, he must have been close by when Drew fell. The bosun broke up the crowd, and Hadrian, once more unsure of his duty, stood idle. The first light of dawn arrived, revealing a dull gray sky above a dull gray sea that lurched and rolled like a terrible dark beast. "Cook!" a voice barked sharply. Hadrian turned to see a young boy who was not much older than Poe, but wearing a jacket and braid of an officer. He stood with a firm set jaw and a posture so stiff he seemed made of wood. His cheeks were flushed red with the cool night air, and rainwater ran off the end of his nose. "Aye, sir," Hadrian replied, taking a guess it would be the right response. "We are securing from all hands. You're free to fire the stove and get the meal ready." Not knowing anything better to say, Hadrian replied, "Aye, aye." He turned to head for the galley. "Cook," the boy officer snapped disapprovingly. Hadrian pivoted as sharply as he could, recalling some of his military training. "Aye, sir," he responded once more, feeling a bit stupid at his limited vocabulary. "You neglected to salute me," he said hotly. "I'm putting you on report. What's your name?" "Hadrian, sir." "Blackwater, sir." "I'll have the respect of you men even if I must flog you to obtain it. Do you understand? Now let's see that salute." Hadrian imitated the salute he had seen others perform by placing his knuckles to his forehead. "That's better, seaman. Don't let it happen again." "Aye, aye, sir." It felt good to get down out of the rain and wind, and Poe met him on the way to the galley. The boy knew his way around the kitchen well, which was no doubt why Wyatt had suggested him. They fired up the stove, and Hadrian watched Poe go to work, cooking the morning oatmeal, adding butter and brown sugar in proper amounts, and asking Hadrian to taste test it. Despite its name, the skilliculia was surprisingly good. Hadrian couldn't say the same about the biscuits, which were rock hard. Poe had not made them. He had merely fetched the round stones from the bread room where boxes of them were stored. Hadrian's years of soldiering had made him familiar with hardtack, as they were known on land. The ubiquitous biscuits lasted forever, but were never very filling. They were so hard that you had to soften them in tea or soup before eating them. With the meal made, stewards from the mess arrived to gather their shares and carry them below. Hadrian entered the berth deck, helping the mess steward carry the last of the servings. "Bloody show-off couldn't even make it up the lines," Jacob Durning was saying loudly. The men of the tops and the petty officers sat together at the tables as befitted their status on board, while others lay scattered with their copper plates amid the sacks and chests. Jacob looked like he was holding court at the center table. All eyes were on him as he spoke with grand gestures. On his head, he wore a bright blue kerchief, as did everyone on the foretop crew. "It's a different story with him when the sea is heaving and the lines are wet," Jacob went on. "You don't see him prancing then." "He looked scared to me," Bristol, the boatswain, added. "Thought I was going to have to go up and wallop him good to get him going again." "Royce was fine," said a thin, gangly fellow with a white kerchief tied over his head and a thick blonde walrus mustache. Hadrian didn't know his name, but recognized him as the captain of the main top. "Just seasick, that's all." Once he was aloft, he reefed the topsail just fine, albeit a bit oddly. "Make excuses for him all you want, Dime," Jacob told him, pointing a finger his way. "But he's a queer one, he is, and I find it more than a little dodgy that his first day aloft finds his fellow mate falling to his death." "You suggesting Royce killed Drew?" Dime asked. "I ain't saying nothing. Just think it's odd, is all. Of course, you'd know better what went on up there, wouldn't you, Dime?" "I didn't see it. Bernie was with him on the topsail yard when he fell. He says Drew just got careless. I've seen it before. Fools like him skylarking in the sheets. Bernie says he was trying to walk the yard when the ship lurched because of that burst from the shoal. He lost his footing. Bernie tried to grab him as he hung onto the yard, but the wetness made him slip off." "Drew walking the yard in a rainstorm?" Jacob laughed. "Not likely." "And where was Royce during all this?" Bristol asked. Dime shook his head. "I don't know. Didn't see him till later, when he turned up at the masthead." "Bernie was playing cards with him last night, wasn't he? I heard Drew walked away with a big pot." "Now you're saying Bernie killed him?" a third fellow with a red kerchief asked. Hadrian had never seen him before, but guessed he must be the captain of the mizzenmast, as the top captains, along with the bosuns, seemed to dine together at the same table. "No, but I'm saying the cook was there and he and Royce are mates, aren't they? I think—" Jacob stopped short when he spotted Hadrian. "Bloody good thing you're a better cook than your mate is a top man, or Mr. Temple's liable to chuck you both in the deep." Hadrian said nothing. He looked around for Royce but didn't find him, which wasn't too surprising as he guessed his friend wouldn't want to be anywhere near food. "Might want to let your mate know I've asked Bristol here to have a word with Mr. Beryl about him." "Beryl?" Bristol responded, puzzled. "I was going to talk to Wesley." "Bugger that," Jacob said. "Wesley's useless. He's a bleeding joke, ain't he?" "I can't go over his head to Beryl," Bristol said defensively. "Wesley was watch officer when it happened." "Are you barmy? What are you scared of?" "Think Wesley's going to have at you for going to Beryl. All Wesley will do is report you. That's all he ever does. He's a boy and hasn't grown a spine yet in that midshipman's uniform of his. Only reason he's on the Storm is 'cause his daddy is Lord Belstrad. We need to serve the midshipman next," Poe reminded Hadrian, urgently tugging at his sleeve. "They mess in the wardroom aft." Hadrian dropped off the mess kit, hanging it from a hook, the way he had seen Poe do, and gave Jacob one last glance only to find the fore-captain grinning malevolently. Far smaller and not much more comfortable than the crew's quarters, the midshipman's mess was the tiny room aft on the berth deck that creaked loudly as the ship's hull lurched in the waves. Normally, Basil delivered the food he cooked for the officers, but this morning he was kept particularly busy working on the lieutenant's and captain's meal, and had asked Poe and Hadrian for help in delivering the food to the midshipman's mess. "What are you doing here?" the biggest midshipman asked abruptly as Hadrian and Poe entered. Hadrian almost answered when he realized the question wasn't addressed to him. Behind them, coming in late, was the young officer who had put Hadrian on report earlier. "You're supposed to be on watch, Wesley. Lieutenant Green relieved me a bit early so I could get some food while it was hot." "So, you've come to force yourself in on your betters, is that it?" the big man asked and got a round of laughter from those with him. This had to be Beryl, Hadrian guessed. He was by far the oldest of the midshipmen by 10 years or more. "You're going to be nothing but a nuisance to the rest of us on this voyage, aren't you, boy? Here we thought we could have a quiet meal without you disturbing us. What did you do? Whine to Green about how your stomach was hurting because we didn't let you have anything to eat last night?" "No, Wesley began. "Shut it! I don't want to hear your sniveling voice. You there, cook?" Beryl snapped. "Don't serve midshipman Wesley any food, not a biscuit crumb, do you understand?" Hadrian nodded, guessing that Beryl somehow outranked Wesley despite both of them wearing midshipman uniforms. Wesley looked angry, but said nothing. The boy turned away from the table toward his sea chest. "Oh, yes," Beryl said, rising from the table and walking across the room to Wesley. As he did, Hadrian noticed an old scar down the side of Beryl's face that looked to have nearly taken out his eye. "I've been meaning to go through your stuff to see if you had anything I might like." Wesley turned, closing his chest abruptly. "Open it, boy, and let me have a look." "No, you have no right." Beryl's toadies at the table jeered the boy and laughed. He took a step forward, and from his posture, Hadrian knew what was coming, even if Wesley was oblivious. The big midshipman struck Wesley hard across the face. The boy fell over his sea chest onto his back. He rolled to his side, his face red with fury, but never got farther than his knees before Beryl struck him again, this time hard enough to spray blood from his nose. Wesley collapsed to the floor again with a wail of pain and lay crumpled in a ball holding his face. The other midshipmen cheered. Beryl sifted through the contents of Wesley's chest. "All that for nothing. I thought you were a lord's son. This is pathetic." He pulled a white linen shirt out and looked it over. "Well, this isn't too bad, and I could use a new shirt." He slammed the chest and returned to his breakfast. Disgusted, Hadrian started to move to help Wesley, but stopped when he saw Poe earnestly shaking his head. The young seaman took hold of Hadrian's arm and nearly dragged him back up to the main deck, where the sun had risen sufficiently enough to cause them to squint. "Don't involve yourselves in the affairs of officers," Poe told them earnestly. "They're just like nobles. Strike one, and you'll hang for it. Trust me, I know what I'm talking about. My older brother Ned is the coxswain on the Immortal. The horror stories he's told me can turn one's stomach." "Blimey, you act like you've never been on a ship before." Hadrian didn't say anything as he followed Poe back toward the galley. "You haven't, have you?" Poe asked suddenly. "So who is this big fellow? Is he Beryl?" Hadrian asked, changing the subject. Poe scowled, then sighed. "Yep, he's the senior midshipman, so Beryl's a noble. Don't know if he is or he ain't. Most are third or fourth sons, the ones not suited for tournaments or monastic life, who volunteer to serve, hoping they can one day manage a captain's rank, rule their own ship, and make some money. Most midshipmen only serve about 5 years before making lieutenant. But Beryl, he's been a midshipman for something like 10 years now, I reckon. I guess it makes a man sort of cranky being left behind like that. Even if he isn't a true blue-blooded noble, he's still an officer. And on this ship, that means the same thing." "Royce," Hadrian whispered. Royce lay in his hammock near the bow of the ship, his head still covered with a white kerchief, the insignia of the main top crew. He was shivering and wet, lying in soaked clothes. "Royce," he repeated. This time he shook his partner's shoulder. "Do that again and I'll cut your hand off," he growled, his voice garbled and sickly. "I brought you some coffee and bread. I put raisins in the bread. You like raisins?" Royce peered out from under his thin blanket with a vicious glare. He eyed the meal and promptly looked away with a grimace. "Sorry, I just knew you hadn't eaten since yesterday." Hadrian put the tray down away from him. "They gave you extra duty, didn't they? You seem to be up there longer than anyone else." "Bristol kept me on station as punishment for being slow yesterday. How long was I up there?" 12 hours at least. Listen, I thought we'd have a look around the forward hold. Wyatt tells me the Sarret are hiding a special cargo up there. If you can get your stomach under control, maybe you can open a few locks for me." Royce shook his head. "Not until this ship stops rolling. I stand up and the world spins. I've got to sleep." "How come you're not sick?" "I am, but not like you. I guess elven blood and water don't mix." "It might," Royce said, disappearing back under his blanket. "If I don't start feeling better soon, I'll slit my wrists." Hadrian took his blanket, laid it over the shivering form of Royce, and was about to head back up topside when he paused and asked, "Any idea what happened to Edgar Drew? The guy that fell?" "Yeah. Some of the crew think he might have been murdered. I didn't see anything. Spent most of my time hugging the mast. I was pretty sick. Still am. Get out of here and let me sleep." It was late and the port watch was on duty. But most of them slept on deck or in the rigging. Only a handful had to remain alert during the middle watch. 3 lookouts aloft at the masthead, the quartermaster's mate who manned the wheel in Wyatt's absence, and the officer of the watch. Adrian nearly ran into this last man as he came on deck. "Mr. Wesley, sir?" Adrian said, shifting the tray so he could properly perform the salute. Wesley's face was blotchy, and his nose and eyes black and blue. Adrian knew he was standing an additional watch. On his way to Royce, Adrian had overheard Lieutenant Bishop questioning the midshipman about a brawl. But because Wesley had refused to divulge the name of his adversary, the young man took the punishment alone. "Mr. Wesley, I thought you might like something to eat. I'm guessing you haven't had much today." The officer glared at him a moment, then looked at the tray. As he saw the steam rising from the coffee cup, his mouth opened and abruptly shut. "Who sent you here? Was it Beryl? Is this supposed to be funny?" "No, sir. I just know you didn't get to eat breakfast and you've been on duty through the rest of the meals today. You must be starved." "You were ordered not to feed me," Adrian shrugged. "I've also been ordered by the captain to see that the crew is fed and fit for duty. You've been up for a long time. A man could fall asleep without something to help keep his eyes open." Wesley looked back down. "That's coffee, isn't it?" the young midshipman asked, astonished. "There's not more than a few pounds of that on the entire ship, most of which is reserved for the captain. I did a bit of trading this afternoon with the purser and managed to get a couple of cups worth. Why offer it to me?" Adrian looked up at the night sky. "It's a cold night, and punishment for falling asleep can be severe." Wesley nodded gravely. "On this ship, a midshipman is flogged. Do you think that's Beryl's plan, sir? For standing up to him this morning in front of the other officers, I mean? Maybe. Beryl is a tyrant of the worst order and a libertine who squandered his family's fortune. I suspect Beryl would not even notice me if it were not for my brother. By beating me, he thinks he's superior to our family." "Your brother is Sir Brecton Belstrade." Wesley nodded. "But the joke is on him. I am nothing like my brother, so besting me is no great accomplishment. If I were like him, I wouldn't allow myself to be bullied by a lout like Beryl." "Take the coffee and bread, sir," Adrian said. "I can't say I care for Beryl, and if keeping you awake tonight gets under his skin, it'll make tomorrow all the better in my book. The orders of the captain override a senior midshipman. I'll still have to put you on report for this morning. This kindness will not change that." "I didn't expect it to, sir." The midshipman studied Adrian, his face betraying a new curiosity. "In that case, thank you," he said, taking the food. Dovin Thranich walked through the waist hold. Dark and cramped, the ship's bottom deck reeked of animal dung and salt water. A good 4 inches of liquid slime pooled along the center-line gutter, forcing him to walk up the sides, hurdling the futtock rider beams to keep his shoes dry. The next day, he would order Lieutenant Bishop to direct the detail of men to work the bilge pump in the evening to ensure he did not need to go through this every night. He was a sentinel of the Nephron Church, presently one of only 2 men allowed to speak personally with His Holiness, the Patriarch. And yet here he was crawling through sewage. His unsettled stomach made the ordeal even more miserable. After several days of sleeping on board the Emerald Storm while it was in dock, he thought he'd gained his sea legs. His initial wretchedness had subsided only to return now that the ship was rolling at a different cadence on the open sea. While not nearly as bad as before, his nausea was still a nuisance and would make his work less enjoyable. Thranik carried no light, but did not need one. The sentries' lanterns at the far end of the hold gave sufficient illumination for him to see. He passed several sentries, Siret, who stood rigidly at their stations, ignoring his approach. "They seem quiet tonight. Have they been behaving?" Thranik asked as he approached the cages. "Yes, sir," the senior guard replied, breaking his statuesque facade only briefly. "Seasickness. They're all under the weather." "Yes," Thranik noted, not without a degree of revulsion. He watched them. "They can see me, you know, even in the dark. They have very good eyesight." Because a response was not required, the Siret remained silent. "I can see recognition on their faces, recognition and fear. This is my first trip to visit them, but already they know me. They can sense the power of Novron within me, and the evil in them instinctually cowers. It's like I'm a candle, and the light I give off pushes back their darkness." Thranik stepped closer to the cages. Each so densely packed, the elves were forced to take turns standing and lying. Those standing pressed their filthy naked bodies against each other for support. Males, females, and children were jammed together tightly, creating a repugnant, quivering mass of flesh. He watched with amusement as they whimpered and whined, struggling to move away from his approach. "See, I am light, and the putrid blackness of their souls retreats before me." Thranik studied their faces, each gaunt and hollow from starvation. They're disgusting creatures, unnatural, abominations that never should have been. Their very existence is an insult. You feel it, don't you? We need to purge the world of the stain they cause. We need to do our best to clear the offense. We need to prove ourselves worthy. Thranik was no longer looking at the elves. He was staring at his own hands. Purification is never easy, but always necessary, he muttered pensively. "Fetch me that tall male with the missing tooth," Thranik ordered. "I'll begin with him." Following the sentinel's direction, the guards ripped the elf from his cage and bound his elbows behind his back. Using a spare rigging pulley, they hoisted the unfortunate prisoner by his arms to the overhead beam. The effort pulled the elf's limbs from their sockets, causing him to scream in agony. His wails and the wretched look on his face caused even the Siret to look away. But Thranik watched stoically, his lips pursed approvingly. "Swing him," he said. The elf howled anew from the motion. The sentinel looked at the cages again. Inside, others were weeping. At his glance, one female pushed forward. "Why can't you leave us alone?" Thranik searched her face with a look of genuine pity. "Maribor demands that the mistake of his brother be erased. I'm merely his tool." "Then why not? Why not just kill us and get it over with?" She cried at him, eyes wild. Thranik paused. He stared once more at his hands. He turned them over, examining both sides with a distant expression. He was silent for so long that even the Siret turned to face him. Thranik looked back at the female, his eyes blurring and lips trembling. One must scrub very hard to remove some stains. Take her next. Chapter 7. Rotten Eggs. For Empress Modena, everything had changed a month ago, after she had stood on the balcony and addressed the citizens of the new empire. Due to Amelia's constant chipping away at the region's resolve, the Empress now enjoyed an unprecedented degree of freedom within the palace, and she wandered freely, dressed in fresh new clothing. She never went anywhere in particular, and oftentimes after returning she could not recall where she had been. Although she longed to feel grass beneath her feet, Her permitted boundary did not extend past the palace walls. She was certain no guard would stop her if she tried to leave, but she feared Amelia would suffer the Regent's wrath if she did, so she remained inside the keep. Now Modena walked gracefully in her new dress, silent and pensive, the way an empress should. As she descended the curved stair, she felt the hem of her gown drag along the stone steps. The new dresses had also been Amelia's doing. Her secretary had personally supervised the imperial seamstress in their construction, and curtailed any attempts the woman tried to make to embellish them with lace or embroidery. Each was brilliant white and patterned after a simple yet eloquent design. Amelia had told the seamstress that the main goal was to create clothing that would make Modena feel as comfortable as possible. So the dressmaker focused on constructing plain but well-fitted garments and dispensed with utilizing stiff collars, tight bodices, or stays. While the freedom in new dresses had been welcome changes, the most dramatic difference had been the way people reacted when seeing the Empress. Since leaving her bedroom, Modena had passed two young women carrying a pile of linens and a page with an armful of assorted boots. He had dropped one the moment he spotted her, and the two girls chatted excitedly to each other. She'd seen in their faces the same look that everyone wore, the belief that she was the chosen one of Maribor. When she had first come to the palace, everyone had avoided her the way one evades a dog known to bite. After her speech, those few members of the palace staff she chanced upon had looked at her with affectionate admiration and an unspoken understanding, as if acknowledging that they finally comprehended her previous behavior. The new gowns had the unintended effect of turning admiration into adoration, as the white purity and modest simplicity gave Modena an angelic aura. She had transformed from the mad empress to the saintly, although troubled, high priestess. Everyone attributed Modena's recovery to Amelia's healing powers. What she had said on the balcony was the truth. Amelia had saved her, if saved was the right word. Modena did not feel saved. Ever since Dahlgren, she had been drowning in overwhelming terrors that she could not face. Amelia had pulled her to the shore, but no one could call her existence living. There had been a time, long, long ago, when she would have said that life carried hope for a better tomorrow. But for her, hope was a dream that had blown away on a midsummer's night. The horrors were all that remained, calling to her, threatening to pull her under again. It would be easy to give in, to close her eyes and sink to the bottom once more. But if pretending to live could help Amelia, then she would. Amelia had become a tiny point of light in a sea of darkness, the singular star Modena steered by, and it didn't matter where that light led. Like most afternoons, Modena wandered the sequestered halls and chambers like a ghost, searching for something long forgotten. She heard that people with missing limbs felt an itching in a phantom leg or arm. Perhaps it was the same for her as she struggled to scratch at her missing life. The smell of food indicated she was near the kitchen. Modena didn't recall the last time she had eaten, but she was not hungry. Ghosts did not get hungry, at least not for food. She had come to the bottom of the stairs. To the right, cupboards lined a narrow room holding plates, goblets, candles, and utensils. To the left, folded linens were stacked on shelves, filled with laboring servants and steam. The place was hot and noisy. Modena spotted the big elk-hound sleeping in the corner of the kitchen, and immediately recalled that his name was Red. She hadn't been down this way in a long time, not since Saldor had caught her feeding the dog. That was the first day since her father had died that she could remember clearly. Before that, nothing but rotten eggs. She smelled the rancid stench as she stood at the bottom of the steps. Modena glanced around with greater interest. That awful smell triggered a memory. There was a place, a small room, that was cold, dark, and lacked any windows. She could almost taste it. Modena approached a small wooden door. With a shaking hand, she pulled it open. Inside was a small pantry filled with sacks of flour and grain. This was not the room, but the smell was stronger there. There was another place, small like this, small, dark, and evil. The thought came at her with the force of a forgotten nightmare, black, earthy, and cold. A splashing and a ratcheting that echoed ominously, the wails of lost souls crying for mercy and finding none. She had been one of them. She had cried aloud in the dark until she could cry no more. And always the smell of dirt penetrated her nostrils, and the dampness of the dirt floor soaked into her skin. A sudden realization jolted her. I'm remembering my grave. I am dead. I am a ghost. She looked at her hands. This was not life. The darkness closed in all around her, growing deeper, swallowing her, smothering her. Are you all right, Your Eminence? You think she's sick again? Don't be daft. She's just upset. You can see that well enough, can't you? Poor thing. She's so fragile. Remember who you're speaking of. That lass slew Rufus's bane. You remember who you're speaking of. That lass, indeed. She's the Empress. Out of my way, Emilia growled as she shooed the crowd like a yard full of chickens. She was in no mood to be polite. Fear made her voice harsh, and it lacked the familiar tone of a fellow kitchen worker. It was the voice of an angry noblewoman. The servants scattered. Modena sat on the floor with her back against the wall. She was weeping softly, with her hands covering her face. What did you do to her? Emilia snapped accusingly, while glaring at the lot of them. Nothing, Leif said, defending them. Leif, the butcher and assistant cook, was a scrawny little man with thick, dark hair, covering his arms and chest, but absent from his balding head. Emilia had never cared for him, and the thought that he or any of them might have hurt Modena made her blood boil. No one was even near her, I swear. That's right, Cora confirmed. The dairymaid was a sweet, simple girl who churned the butter each morning and always added too much salt. She just sat and started crying. Emilia knew better than to listen to Leif, but Cora was trustworthy. All right, she told them. Leave her be. Back to work, all of you. They were slow to respond, until Emilia gave them a threatening glare. Are you all right? What's wrong? She asked, kneeling beside Modena. The Empress looked up and threw her arms around Emilia's neck as she continued to sob uncontrollably. Emilia held her, stroking her hair. She had no idea what was wrong, but needed to get the Empress to her room. If word reached Saldor, or worse, if he wandered in, she tried not to think of it. It's okay. It's all right. I've got you. Try to calm down. Am I alive? Modena asked with pleading eyes. For the briefest of moments, Emilia thought she might be joking. But there were two things wrong with that. First, there was the look in Modena's eyes. And second, the Empress never joked. Of course you are, she reassured her. Now come, let's get you to bed. Emilia helped her up. Modena stood like a newborn fawn, weak and unsure. As they left, excited whispering rose. I'll have to deal with that right away, she thought. She guided Modena upstairs. Gerald, the Empress's personal guard, gave them a concerned look as he opened the chamber door. Is she all right? Gerald asked. She's tired, Emilia said, closing the door on him. The Empress sat on the edge of her bed, staring at nothing. This wasn't her familiar blank stare. Amelia could see her thinking hard about something. "Were you sleepwalking? Did you have a nightmare?" Modena thought a moment, then shook her head. "I remembered something." Her voice was faint and airy. It was something bad. Was it about the battle? This was the first time Amelia had brought up the subject. Details of Modena's legendary combat with the beast that had destroyed Dahlgren were always vague or clouded by so much dogma and propaganda that it was impossible to tell truth from fiction. Like any imperial citizen, Amelia was curious. The stories claimed Modena had slain a powerful dragon with a broken sword. Just looking at the Empress, she knew that could not be true. But Amelia was certain something terrible had happened. "No," Modena said softly. "It was afterward. I woke up in a hole, a terrible place. I think it was my grave. I don't like remembering. It's better for both of us if I don't try." Amelia nodded. Since Modena had begun speaking, most of their conversations had centered on Amelia's life in Tiaran Vale, on the few occasions when she asked Modena about her own past. The Empress's expression darkened, and the light in her eyes faded. She wouldn't speak anymore after that, sometimes for days. The skeletons in Modena's closet were legion. "Well, don't think about it then," Amelia told her in a soothing voice. She sat next to Modena on the edge of the bed and ran her fingers through the Empress's hair. "Whatever it was, it's over. You're here with me now. It's getting late. Do you think you can sleep?" The Empress nodded, but her eyes remained troubled. Once she was certain the Empress was resting peacefully, Amelia crept out of her room. Ignoring Gerald's questioning looks, she trotted downstairs to the kitchen. If left to themselves, the scullions would start a wave of rumors, certain to engulf the entire palace, and she couldn't afford to have this getting back to Soldo. Amelia had not visited the kitchens for quite some time. The moist, steamy cloud that smelled of onions and grease once so familiar was now oppressive. 8 people worked the evening shift. There were several new faces, mostly young boys fresh off the street and girls still smelling of farm manure. All of them worked perfunctorily, as if they were engrossed in the conversation that rose above the sound of the boiling kettles and the clatter of pans. That all stopped when she entered. "Amelia!" Ibis thinly boomed the moment he saw her. The old sea cook was a huge barrel-chested man with bright blue eyes and a beard that wreathed his chin. Blood and grease stained his apron. He held a towel in one hand and a spoon in the other. Leaving a large pot on the stove, he strode over to her, grinning. "You're a fine sight for weathering eyes, lass. How's life treating you? Why don't you visit more often?" She rushed to him, ignoring his filthy garment and all courtly protocol. She hugged the big man tight. The water boy dropped both buckets and gasped aloud. Ibis chuckled. "It's as if they plumb forgot you used to work here. Like they think their old Amelia died or something and the chief imperial secretary to the new empress grew out of thin air." He put down the spoon and took her by the hand. "So how are you, lassie?" "Really good, actually." "I hear you got a fancy place up there in the East Wing with all the swells. That's something to be proud of, that is. You're moving up in the world." "There's no mistaking that. I just hope you don't forget us down here. If I do, just burn my dinner, and I'll remember who the really important people are." "Oh, speaking of that." Ibis quickly used the towel to lift the steaming pot from the stove. "Don't want to be ruining the sauce for the Chamberlain's quail. How are things here?" "Same as always." He hoisted the pot onto the stone bench and lifted the lid, freeing a cloud of steam. Nothing changes in the scullery? You picked a fine time to visit. Edith ain't here. She's upstairs hollering at the new chambermaid. Amelia rolled her eyes. They should have dismissed that woman years ago. Don't I know it? But I only run the kitchen and don't have no say over what she does. Course, you being a swell and all now, maybe. She shook her head. I don't have any real power. I just take care of Medina. Ibis used the spoon to taste the sauce before replacing the lid. Well now, I know you didn't come here to jaw with me about Edith Mon. This have something to do with the Empress crying down here a bit ago? It wasn't the pea soup I made for her, was it? Napimon, Amelia assured him. She loves your cooking. But yes, I did sort of want to explain things. She turned to face the rest of the staff and raised her voice. I just wanted everyone to know the Empress is okay. She heard some bad news today and it saddened her is all, but she's fine now. Was it about the war? Nipper asked. I bet it had to do with the prisoners in Radabor, Nob the baker speculated. The princess from Melangar done executed them, didn't she? Everyone knows she's a witch and a murderess. She'd think nothing of slaughtering defenseless folk. That's why she was weeping, wasn't it? 'Cause she couldn't save them. The poor dear, the butcher's wife declared. She cares so much. It's no wonder she's so upset with everything she has to deal with. Thank Mirabor she has you taking care of her, Lady Amelia. You're a mercy, and then some. You are. Amelia smiled and turned to Ibis. Didn't she always used to yell at me about the way I cleaned her husband's knives? Ibis chuckled. She also accused you of taking that pork loin a year ago last spring. Said you ought to be whipped. I guess she forgot about that. They all have, I suspect. It's the dress, I think. Seeing you in a gown like this, even I have to fight the impulse to bow. Don't do that, she told him, or I'll never come back here again. Ibis grinned. It's good to see you again. In her dream, Medina saw the beast coming up behind her father. She tried to scream, but only a muffled moan escaped. She tried to run to him, but her feet were stuck in the mud, thick, green, foul-smelling mud. The beast had no trouble moving as it charged down the hill toward him. To Medina's anguished amazement, Theron took no notice of the ground shaking from the monster's massive bulk. It consumed him in a single bite, and Medina collapsed in the dirt. The musty smell filled her nostrils as she struggled to breathe. She could feel the damp earth against her body. In the darkness, the sounds of splashing told her that the beast came for her too. All around, men and women cried and howled in misery and fear. The beast came for them all, splashing, cranking, splashing, cranking. It was coming to finish the job, coming to swallow her up as well. It was hungry, very hungry. It needed to eat. They all needed to eat, but there was never enough food. What little they had was a putrid gruel that smelled awful, like rotten eggs. She was cold, shivering and weeping. She'd cried so hard for so long that her eyes no longer teared. There was nothing left to live for, or was there? Medina woke in her darkened room, shivering in a cold sweat. The same dream haunted her each night, making her afraid to close her eyes. She got up and moved toward the moonlight of her window. By the time she reached it, most of the dream was forgotten, but she realized something had been different. Sitting in her usual place, she looked out over the courtyard below. It was late, and everyone was gone, except the guards on watch. She tried to remember her nightmare, but the only thing she could recall was the smell of rotten eggs. Chapter 8. The Horn. After the first few disorienting days, life aboard the Emerald Storm settled into a rigid pattern. Every morning began with the scrubbing of the upper deck, although it never had a chance to get dirty from one day to the next. Breakfast followed. The watches changed and the scrubbing continued, this time on the lower decks. At noon, Lieutenant Bishop or one of the other officers fixed their position using the sun and confirmed it with the captain. Afterward, the men drilled on the masts and yards, launching long boats, boarding and rappelling, and practicing archery, the ballista, and hand-to-hand combat. Not surprisingly, Hadrian won high marks in sword fighting and archery, his display of skill not lost on Grady, who nodded knowingly. From time to time, the men were drummed to the main deck to witness punishment. So far, there had been 4 floggings, but Hadrian knew the victims only by name. In the afternoon, the men received their grog, a mixture of rum and sugar water, and in the evening the master-at-arms went about making certain all fires were out. Most days were the same as the one before, with only a few exceptions. On Making Mend Day, the captain granted the crew extra time in the afternoon to sew up rips in their clothing or indulge in hobbies such as wood carving or scrimshaw. On wash day, they cleaned their clothes. Because using fresh water was forbidden, there was no soap. Shirts and pants usually felt better after a day working in the rain than they did after wash day. By now, everyone knew his responsibilities and could perform them reasonably well. Hadrian and Royce were pleased to discover that they weren't the only novices aboard. Recently pressed men composed nearly a quarter of the crew. Many came from as far away as Alban and Dunmore, and most had never seen the ocean before. The other men's bumbling presence and Wyatt's assistance masked Hadrian's and Royce's lack of experience. Now both knew the routine and the tasks well enough to pass on their own. The Emerald Storm continued traveling due south with the wind on its port quarter, laying it over elegantly as it charged the following sea. It was a marvelously warm day. Either they had run so far south that the season had yet to change, or autumn had blessed them with one last breath of perfect weather. The master's mate and a yeoman of the hold appeared on deck at the ringing of the first bell to dispense the crew's grog. About 4 days into the voyage, Royce finally found his sea legs. His color returned, but even after more than a week, his temper remained sour. One contributing factor was Jacob Durning's constant accusations about his culpability in Drew's death. "After I slit his throat, I can just drop the body into the sea," Royce casually told Hadrian. They'd collected their grog, and the crew lay scattered about the top decks, relaxing in the bright sunshine. Royce and Hadrian found a cozy, out-of-the-way space on the waist deck between the longboat and the bulkhead, where the sailmaker and his mates had left a pile of excess canvas. It made for a luxurious deck bed from which to watch the clear blue sky with its decorative puffs of clouds. "I'll dump him at night and he's gone for good. The body won't even wash up on shore because the sharks will eat it. It's better than having your own personal vat of lye." "Okay, one more time." Hadrian had become exhausted from the conversation. "You can't kill Jacob Durning. We have no idea what's going on yet. What if he's Merrick's contact? So until we know something, anything, you can't kill anyone." Royce scowled and folded his arms across his chest in frustration. "Let's get back to what we know," Hadrian went on. "Like the fact that Bernie Defoe was once in the Black Diamond." Royce replied. "Really? Well, that's interesting. So let's see. We've got a cargo full of elves, enough weapons to outfit an army, a sentinel with a company of Serid, a Tenkin, and an ex-Diamond. I think Thranit must be part of this. I doubt a sentinel is just taking a pleasure cruise. He does stand out like a knife in a man's back, which is why I doubt he's involved. Okay, let's put him in the maybe category. That leaves Bernie at the top of the list. Was he in the guild at the same time as you and Merrick?" Royce nodded. "But we never worked with him, hardly ever saw him. Bernie was a digger, specialized in robbing crypts mostly, and then he got into looking for buried treasure. Taught himself to read so he could search old books for clues. He found Gable's Corner and the Laurentian Crypt, apparently buried somewhere out in Villain Hills. Came back with some nice stuff, and all these tall tales about ghosts and goblins. He ended up having some disagreement with the jewel, and it wasn't long before he went independent. Never heard of him after that. But Merrick knew him, right? Yeah. Think he recognized you? I don't know. Maybe. He wouldn't let on if he had. He's no fool. Any chance he's turned a new leaf and taken up sailing for real? About as likely as me doing it. Hadrian eyed Royce for a heartbeat. I put him at the top of the list. What about the Tenkin? That's another strange one. Land ho, the lookout on the foremast shouted while pointing off the port bow. Royce and Hadrian got up and looked in the direction indicated. Hadrian couldn't make out much, just a thin gray line, but he thought he could see twin towers rising in the distance. Is that? Drummond Door, Royce confirmed, glancing over his shoulder before sitting back down with his rum. Oh yeah? We're that far south. Been a while since we've been around here. Don't remind me. Okay, so the fortress wasn't the best of times, but the city was nice. You have to admit, Tour de la Four is better than Colnora, really. Beautiful climate, brightly painted buildings, and an aqua sea. And it's a republic port. You've got to love an open city. Oh? Remember how many times you banged your head? Hadrian frowned at him. You really do hate dwarves, don't you? Honestly, I'm surprised you let Magnus stay at the Abbey. All right, so there's a bit too much dwarven architecture there, but it sure is built well. You've got to admit that. And you like the wine. Remember. Royce shrugged. What were you going to say about the Tenkin? Oh yeah, his name is Store. Doesn't seem like the sailor type. No. Hadrian shook his head. He's a warrior. Most Tenkin men are. Thing is, Tenkins never leave the garum. The what? You've never been to Calais, have you? The whole eastern half is tropical forest, and the thickest part is a jungle they call the garum. This is the first time I've ever seen a Tenkin outside of Calais, which makes me think Stoll is an outcast. Doesn't sound like the type Merrick would be doing business with. So Bernie remains our number one. Hadrian thought a moment. You think he had anything to do with Drew's death? Maybe, Royce replied, taking a sip of rum. He was on the main mast that night, but I was too sick to pay attention. I wouldn't put it past Bernie to give him a little push. He'd need a reason, though. Drew and Bernie were both at a card game earlier that night. Drew won the pot. And if Bernie is a thief, Royce shook his head. Bernie wouldn't kill him over a gambling dispute. Not unless it was really big money. The coppers and silvers they were playing for wouldn't qualify. That doesn't mean he didn't kill him. It just wasn't about gambling. Anything else happen at the game? Not really. Although Drew did mention he was going to talk to Grady the next morning at breakfast about someone coming aboard to help find a horn. Drew thought it was kind of funny, actually. He seemed to think the horn was easy to find. He was going to go into more detail at breakfast. Maybe Drew overheard something Defoe preferred he hadn't. That's a more likely reason, D. But a horn? They came across Wyatt at the ship's wheel. His plumed hat was off, and his white linen shirt fluttered about his tan skin like a personal sail. He had the storm tied over, playing the pressure of the rudder against the press of the wind. He was staring out at the headland with glassy eyes as they approached, and when he spotted them, he abruptly cast his head down at the binnacle and quickly wiped his face with the sleeve of his forearm. "You all right?" Hadrian asked. Yeah," Wyatt croaked, then coughed to clear his throat. "Fine." He sniffled and wiped his nose. "There's a good chance you'll find her," Royce assured him. "See," Hadrian said, "you've even got Mr. Cynical feeling optimistic about your chances. That's got to count for something." Wyatt forced a smile. "Hey, we got a question for you," Royce said. "Do you have any idea what the horn is?" "Sure. You're looking right at it," Wyatt declared, gesturing towards the point. "That's the Horn of Delgos. As soon as we clear it, the captain will likely order the ship to weather around the point and then tack windward." Royce frowned. "Let's assume for just one moment that I'm not an experienced sailor. Shall we?" Wyatt chuckled. "We're going to make a left turn and head east." "How do you know?" Wyatt shrugged. "The Horn is the farthest bit of land south. If we sail on this course, we'll sail into the open sea. There's nothing out there but whirlpools, inaudible, and sea serpents. If we weather around, turn left, we'll sail up the eastern coast of Delgos." "And what's up that way?" "Not much. These cliffs you see continue all the way around to Vandon, the only other seaport in Delgos. Besides being the headquarters for the Vandon Spice Company, it's also a haven for pirates, or more accurately, the haven for pirates." "We aren't going there either. The Storm is as fine a ship as they come, but the jackals would gather like a pack of wolves and dog her until we surrender, or they sink us." "How does the Spice Company manage any trade surrounded by pirates?" "Who do you think runs the Spice Company?" "Oh. Beyond that?" Royce asked. "Dagestan Bay and the whole of Calais, with ports at West Baden and Dagestan. Then you drift out of civilization and into the Baran Archipelago, and no one goes there, not even pirates. And you're sure this here is the Horn?" "Yep. Every sailor who's ever been in the Karen knows it. It'd be impossible to miss old Drummond Door." Though the coast was still many leagues off, the ancient dwarven edifice was clearly visible now, standing taller than anything Hadrian had ever seen. He smiled at the irony, knowing dwarves had built it. The massive towers were close to 800 feet from the raw, rocky base, where waves crashed to the top of the dome. It appeared to be equal parts fortification and monument. In some respects, it resembled two massive gears laid on their sides, huge cylinders with teeth jutting seaward. From the top of each tower, smoke rose. Midway up were fins, arced openings like gigantic teapot spouts that pointed toward the ocean. Between the twin towers was a single-span stone bridge connecting them like a lintel over the entrance of the harbor. Can't even miss her at night, the way she lights up. You should see her during a full moon when they blow the vents. It puts on quite a show. She's built on a volcano, and the venting prevents too much pressure from building up. Ships in the area often arrange to pass the point at the full moon just for the entertainment, but they also keep their distance. The dwarves that built that fortress sure knew what they were doing. No ship can enter Turlando Bay if the masters of Drummond Door don't want them to. They can spew molten rock for hundreds of feet and burn a fleet of ships to drifting ash in minutes. "We're familiar with how that works," Royce said coldly. Wyatt cocked an eyebrow. "Bad experience." "We had a job there once," Hadrian replied. "A dwarf named Gravis was angry about humans desecrating what he considered a dwarven masterpiece. We had to get in to stop him from sabotaging it." "You broke into Drummond Door." Wyatt looked impressed. "I thought that was impossible." "Just about," Royce answered. "And we didn't get paid enough for the trouble it gave me." Hadrian snorted. "You? I was the one who nearly died making that leap. You just hung there and laughed. How'd you get in? I heard that place is kept tighter than Cornelius Dollar's purse. Wyatt pressed. It wasn't easy, Royce grumbled. I learned to hate dwarves on that job. Well, there, and he trailed off, rubbing his left shoulder absently. It'll be the harvest moon in a few weeks. Maybe we'll catch the show on the way back, Wyatt said. The lookout announced the sighting of sails. Several ships clustered under the safety of the fort, but they were so far out that only their top sails showed. I would have expected the captain to have ordered a course change by now. He's letting us get awfully close. Drumondore can't shoot this far, can she? Hadrian asked. No, but the fortress isn't the only danger, Wyatt pointed out. It isn't safe for an Imperial vessel to linger in these waters. Delgos isn't officially at war with us, but everyone knows the Dolores support the nationalists and, well, accidents can happen. They continued sailing due south. Not until the point was well astern and nearly out of sight did the captain appear on the quarter deck. Now they would discover which direction the Emerald Storm would go. "Heave to, Mr. Bishop," he ordered. "Back the mainsail," the lieutenant shouted, and the men sprang into action. This was the first time Hadrian had heard these particular orders, and he was glad that as ship's cook, he wasn't required to carry them out. It didn't take long for him to see what was happening. Backing the mainsail caused it to catch the wind on its forward side. If the foremast and mizzenmast were also backed, the ship would sail in reverse. Since they remained trimmed as they were, the force of the wind lay balanced between them, leaving the ship stationary on the water. Once the ship was heaved to, the captain ordered a reading on the ship's position, then disappeared once more into his cabin, leaving Lieutenant Bishop on the quarter deck. "So much for picking a direction," Hadrian muttered to himself. They remained stationary for the rest of that day. At sunset, Captain Seward ordered lights hauled aloft, but nothing further slipped his lips. Hadrian served supper, boiled pork stew again. Even he was tired of his menu, but the only complaints came from the recently pressed who were not yet hardened to the conformities of life at sea. Hadrian suspected most of the veterans on board would demand salt pork and biscuits, even on land, rather than break the routine. He is a murderer, that's why. Hadrian heard Stoll shout as he entered the below deck with the last of the evening meals. The Tenkin was standing slightly crouched in the center of the crew's quarters. His dark, tattooed body and rippling muscles were revealed as he removed his shirt. In his right hand, he held a knife. A cloth wrapped his left fist. His chest heaved with excitement, a mad grin on his face, and a sinister glare in his eyes. In front of Stoll stood Royce. He killed Edgar Drew. Everyone knows it. Now he'll be the one to die, eh? Royce stood casually, his hands loosely clasped before him, as if he were just one of the bystanders, except his eyes never left the knife. Royce followed it as a cat might watch the movement of a string. It took Hadrian only a second to see why. Stoll was holding the knife by the blade. On a hunch, Hadrian scanned the room and found Bernie Defoe standing behind, and to Royce's left, a hand hidden behind his back. Stoll took his attention off Royce for a moment, but Hadrian noticed his weight shift to his rear foot, and hoped his friend noticed as well. An instant later, Stoll threw the knife. The blade flew with perfect accuracy. Only when it arrived, Royce was not there and the tip buried itself in a deck post. All eyes were on Stoll as he bristled with rage, shouting curses. Hadrian forced himself to ignore the Tenkin and searched for Bernie. He had moved. Spotting the glint of a blade in the crowd, he found him again. Bernie had slipped up behind Royce and lunged. Royce spun. Not taken in by the plot, he faced his old guildmate with the blade Stahl had provided. Bernie halted mid-step, hesitated, and then backed away, melting into the crowd. Hadrian doubted anyone else noticed his involvement. "Ah, you dance well," Stahl shouted and laughed. "That is good. Perhaps next time you trip, eh?" The excitement over, the crowd broke up. As they did, Jacob Durning muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Good to see I'm not the only one who thinks he killed poor Drew." "Royce," Hadrian called, keeping his eyes focused on Jacob. "Perhaps you should take your meal up on the deck, where it's cooler." "That was pleasant," Hadrian said after the two had safely reached the galley and closed the door behind them. "What was?" Poe asked, dishing out the last of the stew for the midshipman. "Oh, nothing, really. A few crewmen just tried to murder Royce." "What?" Poe almost dropped the whole kettle. "Now, can I kill people?" Royce asked, stepping into the corner and putting his back against the wall. He had an evil look on his face. "Who tried to murder him?" "Bernie," Royce replied. "So what am I supposed to do now? Lie awake at night, waiting for him and his buddies, his mates, to knife me?" "Poe, would it be possible for me and Royce to sleep in here at night?" "In the galley, I suppose. Won't be too comfortable. But if Royce is always on time for his watch, and if you tell Mr. Bishop you want him to help with the nighttime boils, he might allow it." "Great, I'll do that. While I'm gone, Poe, can you go below and get us a couple of hammocks that we can hang in here? Royce, maybe you can rig a lock for the door. It's better than being bait." Royce worked both the second dog watch and the first watch, which kept him aloft from sunset until midnight. By the time he returned, Hadrian had obtained permission for Royce to sleep in the galley. Poe had moved up what little gear they had and strung 2 hammocks between the walls of the narrow room. "How is it?" Royce asked, entering the darkened galley and finding Hadrian hanging in the netting. He asked, waking up. "Oh, okay, I guess. The room is too narrow for me. I feel like I'm being bent in half, but it should be fine for you. How was your watch? Did you see Defoe?" "Never took my eyes off old Bernie," he said, grinning and dodging a pot that hung from the overhead beam. Hadrian knew Royce must have enjoyed a bit of revenge on Bernie. If there was ever a place where Royce held an advantage, it was 100 feet in the air, dangling from beams and ropes in the dark of night. Hadrian shifted his weight, causing his hammock to swing. "What did you do?" "Actually, I didn't do anything. But that was what drove him crazy. He's still sweating." "So he did recognize you?" "Oh, yeah. It was like there were 2 moons out tonight. His face was so pale." Royce checked the lines and the mountings of the hammock Poe had installed for him and looked generally pleased with the work. "To be honest, I'm surprised Bernie didn't suffer an accidental fall," Hadrian said. Royce shook his head. 2 accidents off my mast is just bad planning. Besides, Bernie wasn't trying to kill me." "Sure looked that way from where I was standing, and it seemed pretty organized, too." "You think so?" he asked, sitting on the crate of biscuits Poe had brought up for the morning's breakfast. "It's not how I would do it. First, why stage the fight in a room full of witnesses? If they had killed me, they would hang. Second, why attack me below? Like I said, the sea is the perfect place to dispose of a body, and the closer to the rail you get your victim, the easier it is." "Then what do you think they were up to?" Royce pursed his lips and shook his head. "I have no idea. If it's a diversion to rifle our belongings, why not hold it topside? For that matter, why bother with a diversion at all? There have been plenty of times while we were on deck to go through our stuff. You think it was just to intimidate us? If it was, it wasn't Bernie's idea. Threatening to kill me, but not finishing the job is famously fatal. He would know that. Yeah, so Durning put them up to it. Maybe, but I don't know. Durning doesn't seem like someone Bernie would take orders from, especially not such stupid orders. Makes sense. So then, a muffled thump, like another body hitting the deck, brought them to their feet. Adrian threw open the door of the galley and cautiously looked out. The larboard watch was on duty, but rather than the typical watch and snooze routine, they were hard at work running a boat drill. They'd hoisted the longboat from the yard and had it over the side where it bumped the gunwale once more before being lowered into the sea. "Odd time for a lifeboat drill," Wyatt said, walking toward them from the shelter of the forecastle. "Trouble sleeping?" Royce asked. Wyatt beamed a grin. "Look who else is on duty," he told them, pointing at the quarterdeck where Sentinel Thrannik, Mr. Beryl, Dr. Levy, and Bernie Dafoe stood talking. They slipped around the forecastle, moving quickly to the bow. Looking over the rail, Adrian saw 6 men rowing toward a nearby light. "Another ship," Royce muttered. "Really?" "A small, single-mast schooner. No flag." "Is there anything in the longboat?" Adrian asked. "If that's payment going to—" Royce shook his head. "Just the crew." They watched as the sound of the oars faded, then waited. Adrian strained, peering into the darkness, but all he could see were the bobbing light of the little boat and the one marking its destination. "Boat's coming back," Royce announced, "and there's an extra head now." Wyatt squinted. "Who would they be picking up in the middle of the night from Delgos?" They watched as the longboat returned. Just as Royce had said, there was an additional man, a passenger, wrapped in ship's blankets. He was small and thin, with a long, pasty face and wild white hair. He looked to be very old, far too old to be any use as a sailor. He came aboard and spoke to Thrannik and Dr. Levy at length. The old man's things were gathered and deposited beside him. One of the bags came loose and 2 weighty, leather-bound books spilled onto the bleached deck. "Careful, my boy," the old man cautioned the sailor. "Those are one of a kind, and like me, are very old and sadly fragile." "Gather his things and take them to Dr. Levy's quarters," Thrannik ordered. Glancing towards the bow, he stopped abruptly. He glared at them, licking his thin lips in thought, then slowly approached. As he did, he held his dark cloak tight, his shoulders raised to protect his neck from the cold wind. Between this and his stooped back, he resembled a scavenger bird. "What are all of you doing on deck? None of you are part of the larboard watch." "Off duty, sir," Wyatt answered for them. "Just getting a bit of fresh air." Thrannik peered at Adrian and took a step toward him. "You're the cook, aren't you?" Without thinking, Adrian felt at his side for the hilt of his absent sword. Something about the Sentinel made him flinch. Sentinels were always scary, but this one was absolutely chilling. Returning his gaze was like staring into the eyes of restrained madness. "You joined this voyage along with—" Thrannik's eyes shifted to Royce. "This one. Yes, the nimble fellow. The one so good at climbing. What's your name?" "Melbourne, isn't it?" "Royce Melbourne? I heard you were seasick. How odd." Royce remained silent. "Very odd indeed." "Sentinel Thrannik," the old man called, his weak voice barely making the trip across the deck. "I would rather like to get out of the damp wind if I could." He coughed. Thrannik stared a moment longer at Royce, then pivoted sharply and left them. "Not exactly the kind of guy you want taking an interest in you, is he?" Wyatt offered. With the longboat back aboard, The captain appeared on the quarterdeck and ordered a new course, due east into the wind. Chapter 9, Ella. "Another dispatch from Sir Brecton, sir," the clerk announced, handing a small scroll to the Imperial Chancellor. The elderly man returned to the desk in his little office and read the note. A scowl grew across his face. "The man is incorrigible," the Chancellor burst out to no one, then pulled a fresh sheet of parchment and dipped his quill. The door opened unexpectedly, and the Chancellor jumped. "Can't you knock?" "Sorry, Biddings. Did I startle you?" the Earl of Chadwick asked, entering with his exquisite floor-length cape trailing behind him. He had a pair of white gloves draped over one forearm as he bit into a bright red apple. "You're always startling me. I think you get a sadistic pleasure from it." Archibald smiled. "I saw the dispatch arrive. Is there any word from the Emerald Storm?" "No, this is from Bracton." "Bracton? What does he want?" Archibald sat in the armchair opposite the Chancellor and rested his booted feet on the footstool. "No matter how many times I tell him to wait and be patient, he refuses to grasp that we know more than he does. He wants permission to attack Ratibor." Archibald sighed. "Again? I suppose you see now what I've had to put up with all these years. He and Endon are so headstrong. Were," the Chancellor said, correcting him. "Sir Endon died in Dahlgren." Valentine nodded. "And wasn't that a waste of a good man?" He took another bite, and with his mouth still full went on, "Do you need me to write him personally? He's my knight, after all. What would help is to be able to tell him why he doesn't need to attack." Archibald shook his head. "Seldor and Ethelred are still insisting on secrecy regarding the..." The Chancellor raised a hand, stopping him. Archibald looked confused, and the Chancellor pointed at the chambermaid on her knees, scrubbing the floor near the windows of his office. Archibald rolled his eyes. "Oh, please. Do you really think the scrub girl is a spy?" "I've always found it best to err on the side of caution. She doesn't have to be a spy to get you hanged for treason. She doesn't even know what we're talking about. Besides, look at her. It isn't likely she'll be bragging in some pub. You don't go out at night boasting in bars, do you, lass?" Ella shook her head and refused to look up, so that her brown, sweat-snarled hair continued to hang in her face. "See," Archibald said in a vindicated tone. "It's like censoring yourself because there's a couch or a chair in the room." "I was referring to a more subtle kind of danger," Biddings told him. "Should something happen, something unfortunate with the plan such that it fails, someone always has to be blamed. How unfortunate it would be to discover a loquacious earl who had boasted details to even a mindless chambermaid." Archibald's smirk faded immediately. "The third son of a dishonored baron doesn't rise to the position of Imperial Chancellor by being stupid," Biddings said. "Point taken." Archibald glanced back at the scrub girl with a new expression of loathing. "I'd best return to Seldor's office or he'll be looking for me. Honestly, Biddings, I'm really starting to detest staying in this palace." "She still won't see you." "No, I can't get past her secretary. That Lady Amelia is a sly one. Plays all innocent and doe-eyed, but she guards the Empress with ruthless determination. And Seldor and Ethelred are no help at all. They insist she plans to marry Ethelred. It has to be a lie. I simply can't imagine Merdina wanting that old moose. Particularly when she could choose a young buck like yourself." "Exactly. And your desire is true love, of course. You've given absolutely no thought about how marrying Merdina would make you Emperor. For a man who went from Third Baron's son to Chancellor, I'm surprised you can even ask me that." "Archie," bellowed the voice of Regent Seldor, echoing down the hall outside the office. "I'm in with biddings," Archibald shouted back through the open door. "And don't call me." He was interrupted by the sudden rush of the scrub girl running, bucket in hand, from the office. "Looks like she doesn't like Seldor any more than I do." Arista had spilled scrub water onto her skirt, causing it to plaster the rough material to her legs. Her thin cloth shoes made a disagreeable slapping noise as she ran down the corridor. The sound of Seldor's voice made her run faster. That had been close, yet she wondered if even Seldor, who had known her since birth, would recognize her now. There was nothing magical about her transformation, but that didn't make it any less impenetrable. She wore dirty rags, she lacked makeup, and her once lustrous hair was now a tangled mess. It had lightened, bleached by the same sun that had tanned her skin. Still, it was more than just her appearance. Arista had changed. At times, when she caught her own reflection, it took a moment to register that she was seeing herself, and not some poor peasant woman. The bright-eyed girl was gone, and a dark, brooding spirit possessed her battered body. More than anything else, the sheer absurdity of the situation provided the greatest protection. No one would believe that a sheltered, self-indulgent princess would willingly scrub floors in the palace of her enemy. She doubted even Seldor's mind would grant enough latitude to penetrate the illusion. Even if some people thought she looked familiar, and several seemed to, their minds simply couldn't bend that far. To conceive of the thought that Ella the Scrub Girl was the princess of Melangar was as ridiculous as the idea that pigs could talk, or that Miribora was not God. To entertain such a notion would require a mind open to new possibilities, and no one at the palace fit that description. The only one she worried about, besides Seldor, was the Empress's secretary. She wasn't like the others. She noticed Arista. Amelia saw through her veneer with suspicious eyes. Seldor clearly surrounded the Empress with his best and brightest, and Arista did all she could to avoid her. On the road north from Ratibor, Arista had fallen in with a band of refugees fleeing to Equesta, and they'd arrived nearly a month earlier. The location spell had led her to the palace itself. Things grew more complicated after that. If she had been more confident in the magic and her ability to use it, she might have returned to Melangar right away with the news that Gaunt was a prisoner in the Imperial Palace. As it was, she felt the need to see Deegan for herself. She managed to obtain a job as a chambermaid, hoping to repeat the location spell inside the castle walls at various locations, only that wasn't working out. Closely watched by the headmistress, Edith Moon, she rarely found enough free time and privacy to cast the spell. On the few occasions she succeeded, the smoke indicated a direction, but the maze of corridors blocked any attempt to follow. Magically stymied, Arista sought to determine Gaunt's whereabouts by eavesdropping while at the same time learning her way around the grounds. "What have you done now?" Edith Mon shouted at Arista as she entered the scullery. Arista had no idea what a hobgoblin looked like, but she guessed it probably resembled Edith Mon. She was stocky and strong. Her huge head sat on her shoulders like a boulder, crushing whatever neck she might have once had. Her face, pockmarked and spotted, provided the perfect foundation for her broad nose with its flaring nostrils, through which she breathed loudly, particularly when angry, as she was now. Edith yanked the bucket from her hands. "You clumsy little wench. You best pray you spilled it only on yourself. If I heard you left a dirty puddle in the hallway..." Edith had threatened to cane her on 3 occasions, but had been interrupted each time, twice by the head cook. Arista wasn't sure what she would do if it came to that. Scrubbing floors was one thing, but allowing herself to be beaten by an old hag was something else. If she tried, she might discover there was more to her new chambermaid than she had thought. Arista often amused herself by contemplating which curse might be best for old Edith. At that moment, she was considering the virtues of skin worms, but all she said was, "Is there anything else today?" The older woman glared. "Oh, you think you're something, don't you? You think you're better than the rest of us, that your ass shines of silver. Well, it don't. You don't even have a family. I know you live in that alley with the rest of them runners. You're one dodgy smile away from making your meals whoring, so I'd be careful, sweetie." There were several snickers from the other kitchen workers. Some risked Edith's wrath by pausing in their work to watch. The scullery maids, charwomen, and chambermaids all reported to Edith. The others, like the cook, butcher, baker, and cupbearer, reported to Ibis Finlay. But they sided with Edith. After all, Ella was the new girl. In the lives of those who lived in the scullery, seeing punishment administered was what passed for entertainment. "Is that a yes or a no?" Arista asked calmly. Edith's eyes narrowed menacingly. "No, but tomorrow, you start by cleaning every chamber pot in the palace. Not just emptying them, mind you. I want them scrubbed clean." Arista nodded and started to walk past her. As she did, cold water rained down as Edith emptied the bucket on her. The room burst into laughter. "A shame it wasn't clean water. You could use a bath," Edith cackled. The uproar died abruptly as Ibis appeared from out of the cellar. "What's going on here?" The chief cook's booming voice drew everyone's attention. "Nothing, Ibis," Edith answered. "Just training one of my girls is all." The cook spotted Arista standing in a puddle, drenched from head to foot. Her hair hung down her face, dripping filthy water. Her entire smock was soaked through, and the thin material clung indecently to her skin, causing her to fold her arms across her breasts. Ibis scowled at Edith. "What is it, Ibis?" Edith grinned at him. "Don't like my training methods?" "No, I can't say I do. Why do you always have to treat them like this?" "What are you going to do? You're going to take Ella under your wing like that tramp Amelia? Maybe this one will become Archbishop." There was another round of laughter. "Cora!" Ibis barked. "Get Ella a tablecloth to wrap around her." "Careful, Ibis. If she ruins it, the Chamberlain will have at you. And if Amelia hears you called her a tramp, you might lose your head. That little pretender doesn't have the piss to do anything against me." "Maybe," the chief cook said. "But she's one of them now, and I'll bet that any noble who heard that you insulted one of their own, well, they might take it personally." Edith's grin disappeared and the laughter vanished with it. Cora returned with a tablecloth, which Ibis folded twice before wrapping around Arista's shoulders. "I hope you have another kirtle at home, Ella. It's going to be cold tonight." Arista thanked him before heading out the scullery door. It was already dark, and just as Ibis had predicted, cold. Autumn was in full swing, and the night air shocked her wet body. The castle courtyard was nearly empty, with only a few late carters dragging their wagons out through the main gate. A page raced between the stables and the keep, hauling armloads of wood. But most of the activity that usually defined the yard was absent. She passed through the great gates where the guards ignored her, as they had done each evening. The moment she reached the bridge and stepped beyond the protection of the keep's walls, the full force of the wind struck her. She clenched her jaw to stifle a cry, hugged her body with fingers that were already turning red, and shivered so badly it was hard to walk. Not skin worms. No, not nearly bad enough. "Oh dear," Mrs. Barker exclaimed, rushing over as Arista entered Brisbane Alley. "What happened, child? Not that Edith Mon again? Arista nodded. What was it this time? I spilled some wash water. Mrs. Barker shook her head and sighed. Well, come over to the fire and try and dry off before you catch your death.